Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Erica Boehm. I'm the co-editor-in-chief of the Intercultural Human Rights Law Review, and today it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the Intercultural Human Rights Law Review's 11th Annual Symposium. Every year, we strive to put together an event that brings together advocates and scholars from different disciplines. With this event, we try to discuss a human rights issue of great importance to our society. With the help of these distinguished speakers, we publish one volume every year, and it is because of their hard work and their wonderful scholarship that the Intercultural Human Rights Law Review has been ranked as 9th in the world among all human rights law reviews. This means that our publication is cited more often than such heavy hitters as the Human Rights Quarterly. And now, to kick off our event, it's my honor to introduce our Dean, Alfredo Garcia. He has supported both the Intercultural Human Rights Law Review and the LLM and JSD programs in intercultural human rights from their inception. He's even at one time taught in our program, and without his support, this event would not be happening today. Dean Garcia, on behalf of the entire organization, we would like to thank you for your continued support and guidance, without which we would not be such a high-quality organization. Dean Garcia.
Thank you very much, Erica, for your hard work and unstinting devotion to our school, and more importantly, to our Intercultural Human Rights Law Review. I also want to give a special thanks to Astrid Lopez, the moderator, the student who came to me and said, can you support us on this? And I said, of course. It is my duty, honor, and pleasure to do so. 15 years ago, Professor Siegfried Wiesner launched the LLM in Intercultural Human Rights. I was honored and privileged to be asked to teach international criminal law when that program was launched 15 years ago. And I can tell you without equivocation that teaching in that program, and I've been in higher education for over 3 decades, but I'm only 15 years old, so that was probably one of the most rewarding experiences of my academic career, because I truly learned more from the students than they learned from me. When you had students from all over the world, literally, and when you were discussing a problem and an issue involving human rights, they had lived through it, whether it was the genocide in Rwanda, the conflict in Serbia, Herzegovina, or wherever it was, they were there. They had gone through it. They could give a first-hand account. And that's why it was very rewarding. Subsequent to launching that program, Professor Wiesner also launched the JSD in Intercultural Human Rights. Together with, he is, of course, the director of the program, together with the executive director of the program, Dr. Rosa Patti, who is one of the leaders in the fight against human trafficking. In fact, the Human Trafficking Academy will be held next month here with increased participation, both here on ground as well as remotely. It really and truly encapsulates the mission, the values of St. Thomas University School of Law, which above all recognizes the importance of the dignity of every individual in the world. And on behalf of the School of Law, we are honored to have this distinguished panel here, 2 distinguished state senators, a distinguished attorney who is currently a student in our program, someone from NGO and the important work that Amnesty International does, and then 2 renowned scholars. So I think that the editors of the Law Review and Astrid Lopez in organizing this have outdone themselves in bringing together such a distinguished panel, and let's give them a hand for doing that. And without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to present to you the director of our Intercultural Human Rights Program, LLM and JSD, my colleague and friend, Siegfried Wiesner.
Well, thank you, my friend, for this wonderful introduction and of the topic and of the people involved in it. I wanted to really add my voice to the thank yous that you that you gave to Astrid Lopez. Let's have a big hand for her. She put this all together. Usually we have to sort of find the speakers and find topics and all that, but no. This time it was really an entirely student-generated and student-run event. So this event today would not have been possible without Astrid and her team. As she stresses, there are others like the editors-in-chief and the other members of the editorial board. I have to mention Erika Behm, who came here from her Supreme Court perch in Tallahassee, Florida Supreme Court, to be with us today. And she has led this law review not only this year, but the year before, through some crisis situations, which she really salvaged the law school, the law review in admirable ways. Okay? So this is my thank you. And I'd love to sort of introduce the topic from the vantage point of a constitutional law professor here in the United States. What? Oh, you would like? Sure. I thought, okay. Here is the student.
I'm going to bring him back up. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, there are currently an overwhelming amount of protest movements going on right now. And I'm not just talking about in the United States, where we have this privilege, this safeguard called the First Amendment, but this is going on everywhere around the world. Protest movements are historical, and they're responsible for the development of all of our nations, and they're in our history. From Ukraine currently fighting for their independence as we speak, to human rights violators being protested against in China from South Asian students and student activism. Protest movements are just historical, and it's something that every time we see this freedom of expression and freedom to collectively gather and get information together, even the free flow of information through media, is fundamental to the values of American history. So I want to bring up now, even though he's behind me, Professor Siegfried Wiesner is going to start off with our program. This is exactly what our program is about, safeguarding this right universally, because in some parts of the nations, it's not safeguarded and it's severely limited. And it's something that should offend us as a nation. So the first part of our program is going to speak about the United States perspective on the right to protest or the freedom of expression, the First Amendment. Then we're going to have our students have a contrasting view on Venezuela and Cuba and those right to protest. And then our second part of the show, which will be moderated by my co-editor and editor-in-chief of our law review, Erika Behm, in the international and substantive issues of the protests. So without further ado, I'll have to give a round of applause for Professor Siegfried Wiesner. He's the director of our LLM program and our professor here, and my constitutional law professor from first year. So.
Okay, and you see, she really kept a lot of this information throughout the other courses beyond that. What a topic. The right to protest. if you watched yesterday's Fox News or MSNBC or CNN, that's what people were talking about. What is the scope? What are the limits of the right to protest in the United States? We have been the beacon of liberty, have been called that. We have oriented ourselves at philosophers like John Locke, who talked about natural rights of liberty and property. And he would say that a state has no legitimacy if liberty and property were not guaranteed. And that you have, as an individual, a right to a revolution if the state does not warrant that. We will have more here from other speakers on this issue. The purpose of this right as codified, if you want, in the First Amendment is not uniform. It has various policies that would support it. It's an individual right in the first place. I think the freedom of expression is a freedom to realize yourself. Self-determination. Value for society is you are entitled to contribute to the marketplace of ideas. John Stuart Mill. Also, to be able to protest provides a safety valve for society. It brings about an adaptable community. So when there are people who have something to say, they can't be forced, like in Cuba, to just go to the streets when they're supporting the Castro regime. Okay, so there's a misunderstanding. I think democratic regimes achieve their stability over time by allowing the safety valve of free contrarian expression contrary to the government itself. After all, it's the people, not the government, who are sovereign. And we were the first ones spelling that out. We the people in the Constitution. That, however, with responsibility, needs an informed citizenry. So it is also a duty for us to make ourselves ready for contributing to a free and democratic process. The freedom of assembly is guaranteed in the constitutional text. The freedom of association is interpreted into it. It, in the text itself, talks about the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. We have had a tradition here of interpreting this right of the First Amendment in a very broad manner. It encourages, that interpretation encourages robust dialogues and requires the growing of a thick skin. So that's America. You are supposed to participate in it, and there are requirements for courts and others to respect that expression, even if it hurts you. So it hurts you not physically, but, which is often more hurtful, psychologically, and leaves scars behind that do not heal. So we need to know that the courts, particularly the Supreme Court, has encouraged that expansive interpretation which would allow the speech that includes advocacy of racial or other hatred, religious hatred. I would only mention that most other countries are not going that far. And that's reflected in the limitation that Article 20 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights puts on the freedom of expression as an international legal right. Any advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that constitutes incitement to discrimination, hostility, or violence shall be prohibited. So, in other words, it is not covered by the scope of the freedom of expression, Article 19. In contrast, as we said, the First Amendment would allow hate speech unless it constitutes a true threat, unless there is a threat of violence against a person. Violence, even in that broad interpretation, is, however, not acceptable. And we need to be careful to see the limits of demonstrations. We have had the discussion of Ferguson, and there is violence possibly on the side of the protesters and also on the side of the authorities. There are questions about lawfulness of violence in each of the instances, and that will be thoroughly discussed today. The civil rights movement has addressed the issue of civil disobedience. Martin Luther King was booked in the Birmingham city jail, and in a famous letter that he wrote from there, he acknowledged, well, we may have a moral duty to disobey the government when it violates the natural right of equal treatment of persons regardless of their race. But still, we may have to remain within the context of the ramification, the time, place, and manner restrictions the government is setting up for these protests. And if we violate them in order to be more effective, in order to get coverage on the news, for example, then we have to accept the consequences that the law foresees for that. So that's a tradition that has really fostered change in this country, and we still remember the pictures of the march, Selma, in the 1960s, and recently, as we said, Ferguson, and the discussion now at the University of Missouri. I won't assume that I'd have any kind of solution for the diverse viewpoints that are being articulated. Black Lives Matter certainly has focused on the legacy and the remnants that we still see today in our society and state of slavery. So that's something that people feel in a different way when you are in different skins. So that's an important issue of sensitivity that we need to be aware of. And respect should be there, robust as the discussion may be, for the diversity of this society and others. Overall, I think we would be well served by focusing on the establishment of an order of human dignity that I would say leads to the maximum access to all the things humans want out of life. Maximum access to power, to wealth, to affection, to enlightenment, knowledge, to skills. So there are certain things humans value across the world. And I think if we look at the limits of protest movements, as Astrid articulated our topic today, the limits to these movements, we should keep in mind that that everybody should have the right to articulate themselves without violence, but also with respect for the positions that others come from, and the ramifications also of the protests themselves should be seen as, should be interpreted as ones that would allow the utmost protection for the speakers. So if we allow for the framing, of limitations, that should be our guiding light. So I would thank again our Dean for the support that he has always had for this program. Dean Garcia, and before him, Dean Ray is in the audience as well. And my good friends of the faculty like Jay Silver, Susan Warhead and others who have come to see the students and these wonderful speakers perform. I thank the speakers for taking the long ride to come here to South Florida.
Thank you.
And we are excited about what you want to share with us, okay? And so let the games begin.
Thank you, Professor Wiesner, our very own, for that amazing introduction to the First Amendment. Fighting words are limited. Chaplinsky, lays that out, and thank you for laying out all the historical background on the First Amendment. The first part of our program is going to discuss protest movements as a right, and we're going to discuss some of the limits and the limitations. But for this portion of our discussion, because it's very mixed, this portion of our discussion, we're going to have a discussion between the senators. We have State Senator Jamilah Rasheed from St. Louis, Missouri. We have Florida State Senator Dwight Bullard. We have Sarah Hager from Amnesty International USA. Rafael Dominguez, our very own LLM student here, and an attorney in Venezuela, by the way. We have Professor Brian Fonseca, who is from Florida International University, the Director of Public Policy and Citizenship, and the wonderful Lisa Mayer, who is from UMass, and she's an anthropologist. So the first part of our discussion is going to open up. I'm going to ask some questions to some of the senators. It's going to be a discussion, and whereas the audience is also able to participate, there's a mic to the back, and you guys are free to ask questions. The panel members are also free in this part of the discussion to ask questions and join in on the discussion. So Professor Wiesner left off, with remnants of the civil rights movement and Ferguson and some of this University of Missouri, things that I'm sure a lot of you have questions about. I want to ask some of the first questions to Senator Rasheed and Senator Dwight Bullard. Being black senators, clearly obvious, what are some of your personal experiences with the civil rights movements, maybe growing up or in the family members, maybe some of the stories you've heard? Senator Rasheed, you can go first.
Okay. First and foremost, let me just thank you for inviting me here today. I am happy to be here. I can say to you that before I became a politician, I was an African-American bookstore owner, the only African-American female bookstore owner in the St. Louis area. And during that time, I decided to enter the world of activism. It was back in 2002. There were major issues with African-Americans and non-African-Americans competing in the area of construction. We had a major project going on in the St. Louis area on the highway. And there were no African-Americans or Latinos or anyone, minorities, to say the least, on the job site. And so myself and many other activists, we took notice. And we decided to organize, galvanize, and strategize so that more African-Americans or minorities can participate in the project, on the project. So we decided to take to the streets. We went to the highway. We were expressing ourselves peacefully, and we decided to take it up a notch. So what we did was civil disobedience. Now, we had the right to protest, But we didn't have the right to shut the whole highway down. And we did just that. And we went to jail for the cause. But as a result of going to jail, we were able to get concessions as a result of our efforts. And so we thought that we would have to do more, and we didn't, because we went to jail for the cause. And when we went to jail, the media took notice, and they didn't want, the powers to be didn't want that negative energy and that negative picture in a frame. So they hurry up and they got us out of jail immediately. And they said, listen, now let's come to the table. So we went to the table, and as a result of our efforts, we were able to secure a training center for minorities in the areas of construction training center, in the areas of electrical, plumbing, pipe fitting, and things of that sort. We were able to also bring through that training center approximately 300 young minorities with new skills. And that was really a part of my experience in terms of civil disobedience and having the right to express my discontent with the establishment.
Okay, and Senator Bullard, I'm going to ask you the same question. Growing up, what was your personal experience with the civil rights movements? Unless you consider this the civil rights movement, what was your personal experience with growing up?
Well, when we think about civil rights movements, I think people look at them in sort of this linear, microscopic view of a finite period of time. You look at the Montgomery boycott and say, well, okay, that led to the March on Washington, which led to the Civil Rights Act and these things. I view the civil rights movement in more of a cyclical view that has been continuous. And that's one thing that we all have to recognize. Since, African indentured servants were brought to the shorelines of this before the country was founded in the 1600s, there was an initial desire to be set free. Even in indentured servitude before the institution of slavery, you still had a ravenous desire among the folks that were here to make themselves equal to those that are present. That being said, I think it's easy to, if you haven't recognized, even though we all recognize the black doesn't crack, Senator Rasheed and I are one generation removed from the atypical 50s, 60s civil rights movement. So we were kind of born into that, right? We had a particular spirit based on the folks that birthed us into this world to somehow have a level of involvement. In my case, my mother was inspired really from a radicalized standpoint after the stabbing of her brother by a white gang on the south side of Philadelphia to be inspired and pushed into the movement. So she was one of those organizers who felt inspired to do something substantive, but also envelop that in policy. And so that was born into me. And so my involvement in the civil rights movement from a young, youthful standpoint, many of you here probably weren't around during the time of the anti-apartheid movement in the States. Prior to
Do you want to tell us about that, Dwight?
No problem. So prior to the release of Nelson Mandela from prison in South Africa, there was an international movement for divestment. International companies taking their money out of South Africa until apartheid ended. And so from a small standpoint, you had the ripple effects impacting even me at a young age when someone says, we're no longer buying Coca-Cola products until they divest from South Africa, or we're no longer buying Procter & Gamble products until they divest from South Africa. So for me, having meager means, being 9, 10, 11 years old anyway, I wasn't going to take the little money that I had and then spend it on Coke when I had alternatives, whether it was Ritz or any other soda that was out there. It was no big problem to say I'm not going to involve myself from the economic standpoint. Now that actually boils over into something that was very specific to Miami. A few years after the release, actually about a year after the release of Nelson Mandela, before he became the first black president of South Africa, he visited the United States. Because of his interaction with Fidel Castro prior to his imprisonment, many Miami-Dade residents felt it proper to snub his appearance in Miami-Dade County. That led to a financial boycott by the black community of several businesses. It ultimately led to the creation of the first black-owned resort hotel in Miami Beach because of that. And so, again, because of my parents' involvement in the process, I was pulled into the process. And it was very simple. It was very indicative of kind of where my political appetite was at the time to begin with, to say that here's a man who spent 27 years in prison fighting for a cause. He comes to the city of Miami to speak and cannot get a key to the city or cannot get a proclamation because someone feels that him shaking hands or meeting with the Castro brothers in the 1960s was somehow problematic. And that sort of shows you the power of the protest movement, because from that, not only did you get a boom in black economic development, but more importantly, I think it's safe to say that from that, the international reputation of Nelson Mandela was heightened even more. And so when you saw what would happen in South Africa with the vote, folks standing in line, having the first opportunity to vote for someone of their ilk in a long time, part of that was rooted in the fact that Nelson Mandela had gone on this nationwide tour of the United States and had the unfortunate circumstance of coming to Miami and being snubbed. That ended up with him then selling out the Meadowlands Arena in New York. That ends up with him being able to go to the Rose Bowl in Los Angeles because folks felt it embarrassing that one of the largest cities in the country would snub someone like Nelson Mandela. So that's kind of where my protest roots begin.
Interesting. Before I move on to more state senator specific questions, if anyone else living in America or has experienced the civil rights movements during their era, feel free to share. Brian, I saw Lisa waving her head a couple minutes ago. Lisa, why don't you share with us some of the personal experiences you've had growing up during the civil rights movement or after the civil rights movement?
Yeah, I grew up in the south side of Chicago. I lived in Hyde Park, which was at that point a somewhat racially and socioeconomically mixed neighborhood, kind of between the south side near the University of Chicago. And it was a neighborhood, you know, Chicago was, I think, I lived in a little cocoon of this neighborhood where Dr. King came to speak, where Jesse Jackson's movement, Operation Push, had some of its headquarters, and grew up, I was very fortunate to grow up with parents who, although they were white people, you know, were very committed to the cause of racial justice. And we were, you know, we went to protest marches all the time, whether it was around schools, whether it was around funding, I mean, local issues, you know, poor conditions in housing, as well as what was happening in this. I was very much affected by this. I remember when I was 8 years old and, 7 or 8 years old, and my father went on the march from Selma to Montgomery. And I wanted him to take me with him. And he refused to take me. I didn't know anything about police brutality or anything like that. I think as, you know, 8-year-olds, we had the privilege in the 1960s of being a little bit more innocent, and the media wasn't quite so pervasive. So you didn't see this on the local news quite so much. And I didn't know that people were getting, you know, shot and that police dogs were being loose. So I just thought, no, Dad, you're going on this. I want to go with you. I want to meet Dr. Martin Luther King. This is my childhood hero. And he wouldn't take me, and so I organized my third grade class to write letters and gave them to my father. And the family story goes that he met Dr. King in the airport and gave him the letters from my class. And we had to edit them a little bit because some of the kids just wrote, you know, things that had nothing to do with the civil rights movement. It was like, are you having a nice day? You know, do you have a dog? You know, stuff that wasn't really exactly relevant. So we did a little selection at home before we gave them to my father. And according to my father, and I have no way of proving this because both he and Dr. King, are dead, and I can't ask them. Dr. King said to him, "You should have brought her."
Interesting.
Yeah, so I think that this is, and I think, but this doesn't, I want to say this because I think we've had a lot of discussion in this political season about, people, white people kind of riding on our coattails. Like, how can you call me a racist because I marched with Dr. Martin Luther King? And it's not like you get out of, jail free pass for the rest of your life for something that you did at one time. Right? What I did when I was 8 years old is what I did when I was 8 years old. And we're now 50 years beyond that, at least. And so I think that I can't say that that makes me a fighter for racial justice or that means that I have dealt with issues of white privilege. That's kind of constant. You have to keep on renewing it, like year after year after year. It's not something day after day after day. And so what am I doing in my day-to-day life now? What am I doing in my classroom? How am I educating my students? And I think that I feel, I'm an educator, and I teach at a predominantly white college, although it has gotten less blinding over the years. And, how do I talk to my white students about this? How do I create spaces in my classrooms for my students of color? Right. How do you address it? And how do you deal with, the consequences? So I think these are things that, I'm going to have to figure this out, when I go back to class on Tuesday. It's not just, and how do I talk with my students about, what's happening at, Mizzou and what's happening in University of Pennsylvania and Columbia and elsewhere, as well as around the world, right? And so, I don't want to take up more time because I think that we could talk about this for a very long time and then we wouldn't get to hear all the rest of the presentation, so.
Brian or Lisa or Sarah, do you have any personal experiences with the civil rights movement? Or
I wasn't quite into the world yet.
Oh, you weren't into the world
But I'll tell you, maybe anecdotally, I was, so I'm a Latin Americanist by trade, and I was talking about race in a course on Latin American and Caribbean, politics, and we were focused on the island of Hispaniola, particularly talking about racism in Haiti. And one of my students, she was quite passionately ready to jump into discussion, and I asked her for her thoughts, and she decided she was going to stand up, and she was going to say, "Professor, you're wrong. There is no racism in Haiti, right?" And so she went on this sort of monologue to tell me how I had this completely mixed and I was completely backwards. Yet, out of the corner of my eye, I can see a student in the far back just ready to get into the conversation. I was hoping that she was going to save me because I said, "Uh-oh, I must have this entirely wrong." Right. And the student in the back, I called on her. She stood up and she goes, "Professor, I think the reason she's saying that there's no racism in Haiti is because she's high yellow." Right? And I've experienced this, and that was a really profound moment for me, right? I mean, to kind of try to, grapple that, and it kind of diffused very nicely, but it allowed us to transition to a conversation that, I hadn't been a part of yet, right? And sort of that, in that kind of context, but really enlightening moment for me to kind of see that, play out. But I want to listen more to the senators and their experiences.
So back to the state senators, and the audience is obviously free to ask any questions, but State Senator Rasheed and State Senator Dwight Bullard, being state senators and representing the government and the state perspective, how thin is the line between exercising your First Amendment rights and being a politician? What is that like? And additionally, are there many protest movements that go on in the Senate sometimes?
Yes. To answer your last question first, I mean, not nearly as many as I think there should be. I definitely think there needs to be a heightened level of outrage when people are facing atrocities out there in the real world, that government should then intercede. And the expedience of government, everyone talks about government being relatively slow, but it's not until you see the expedience of government in favor of one group and not in favor of another one. I'll give you two sort of glaring examples that I experienced since I've been in the legislature. If you remember Kelly Anthony's death and the sort of controversy around Casey Anthony and the trial that played out. And so Casey Anthony, for those who don't know the backstory, is of course a mother. She was young, she was out partying. Most of the evidence pointed to the fact that she was in some way involved in her child's death, whether it was directly or from negligence. But when the trial happens, She is, of course, exonerated because of lack of substantial evidence. How does this play into the legislature? My colleagues from both sides of the aisle, but who generally happen not to be African American or people of color, reacted in such a visceral way by saying that we have to do something to impact laws. And so they immediately, within a matter of 6 months, passed a law that said if you lied to the police, and it was found that you were lying to the police, that it would result in a felony. And so I was like, wow, government does act quickly. Fast forward to a young man getting shot in Sanford, Florida. Just a year or so later, we had a law in the books that clearly was problematic, right? The idea that someone is able to shoot someone and basically say, because that person, I felt threatened by that individual, I'm therefore justified in the execution of them. And then for those who watch the trial play out on television, the idea that this unarmed teenager, in choosing to fight back, then became the aggressor and thus justified his own death by fighting back, irritated everyone, white, black, and in between. And so, of course, we raise the issue in the legislature and say, hey, listen, Casey Anthony, you guys were outraged. It took us a couple months to pass a bill. We're not asking you to get rid of Stand Your Ground. We're asking you to tweak it so that it no longer negatively impacts these folks, that the George Zimmermans of the world can't use this as an excuse for murder. The law is fine. The law doesn't need to be changed. It's working as it was intended to work, are some of the comments that I received from my colleagues. Now, I don't think anyone can fully appreciate the gut punch that it feels like when someone says the law is working the way it was intended to work and it results in the murder of a black teenager. Because I wear this bracelet every day that simply says, I am Trayvon Martin and you are Trayvon Martin. And I've worn it every day since I've gotten it as a constant reminder of what it is that my work is in the legislature, that I have to constantly be there as a conscience. If my presence isn't established when I walk in the door, it will be and can be easily forgotten. And that was what the 2012-2013 sessions reminded me of, with such glaring, sort of malice, in my opinion.
I remember calling Senator Dwight Bullard and asking him, hey, do you want to sit on a panel for protest movements? And I remember him saying, is there another way? I'm kind of part of the government. So I guess that's where the conversation about that thin line, Senator Rasheed, what kind of thin line might you have to kind of tiptoe across being a senator and also being an American citizen?
When it comes to the legislature, I don't walk the thin line.
Oh, okay.
I go all the way out. Okay. And I'll give you a case in point. After the Ferguson unrest, we took to the street during that time. I'll give you a case in point where we had, it was August the 10th. Michael Brown was just killed on the 9th, okay? And so everyone, we were angry about it. Here you had a young, unarmed individual fleeing and was shot and killed. And so people decided that they were going to take to the street, okay? And not only because of that, but because of the economic and the economic and political oppression that they had to encounter for so long in North County. What we had in North County was what I call debtor's prison, okay? Where you had individuals that lived in the municipalities. They were literally going to jail and being locked up because they couldn't pay their fines. And that was a major problem, because what they were doing was they were creating their budget and sustaining their budget on the backs of the poor, okay? And so when the unrest occurred, individuals came to me and said, what are you going to do on the state level? Okay? So what I had to do was go to my colleagues, Republicans as well as Democrats, and say, listen, we're going to have to do something about it. And so we crafted a bill that dealt with just that issue. Right now, to date, we had a lot of pushback, and I had to take the protest to the floor.
So you did protest.
Against those individuals that were pushing back. But we were able to pass legislation where to date, as a result of the Ferguson unrest, individuals can no longer go to jail simply because they cannot pay a fine. Individuals cannot go to jail simply because because they are driving without insurance. But the biggest fight and the biggest obstacle during the time we were in session, this past session, was the fight to enforce and mandate body cameras. See, in the state of Missouri, we have Republicans that if you even attempt to talk about body cameras, you are anti-law enforcement. And what we were trying to do was get them to understand we're not. We are pro-law enforcement because we truly believe that if you enforce body cameras, then it protects law enforcement from fraudulent lawsuits, and it protects community when it comes to police brutality, because cameras don't lie. And so we had to protest on the floor, argue on the floor the importance and the need to bring forth legislation that would bring the community and law enforcement back together. Well, it fell on deaf ears. So we're going to go back and protest again next session.
Speaking on Ferguson.
And one other issue that we protested as a result of the unrest was the state of Missouri right now. We are not in alignment with Tennessee versus Gardner. Okay? Individuals, and what we need to do is make that a reality in terms of aligning the state statute with Tennessee versus Gardner. But right now, we're not in alignment. And so what we wanted to do was file a piece of legislation to make sure that we're on the same level playing field as the Supreme Court, Tennessee versus Gardner's ruling. And again, the Republicans, they felt like we were against the law enforcement officer in the community. They didn't even want to bring the statute in alignment with Tennessee versus Gardner. So again, we have an unconstitutional law that they didn't want to fix. I'm ready to protest that next session.
Okay.
So I don't walk a thin line. I go above and beyond the call of duty when it comes to trying to right the wrongs and being a voice for the voiceless.
Speaking on Ferguson, since it's such a, what is it about St. Louis that makes it so controversial or either so far ahead or behind? I mean, recently we've heard about the University of Missouri incident where, and I don't know if you want to tell that story since you were closer to the incident, but maybe you can tell us a little bit, since you're a native from St. Louis, information about St. Louis, maybe the demographics about it, or what the biggest misconception is right now that people don't understand about Ferguson.
Well, the biggest misconception, all of St. Louis is Ferguson. Okay, so when you talk to individuals, they would basically say, oh, yeah. I tell them, hey, I live in the city of St. Louis. Oh, you live in Ferguson? No, I don't live in Ferguson. I live in the city of St. Louis, not North County. So that's one. But I think that, again, Ferguson and the people in Ferguson, they were tired of being sick and tired. And the political and economic oppression boiled over.
And this oppression, and I want to be respectful, but this was poverty. Not being able to find a job. The fact that, individual young men, they made mistakes in the past, and
They go and knock on the doors of opportunities, and the doors are slammed in their faces each and every day because they walk in that door with the stigma of being an ex-felon, and they can't find jobs. And so they're angry, frustrated. And when Michael Brown was shot and killed, it only, put more fume to the fire. And so I believe that, yes, it was an issue with a young, unarmed black man being, killed by law enforcement. But at the same time, again, those individuals felt like their voices was not being heard, and that the only way that they will be heard is to take it to the street. And they did just that. And what we saw was appalling. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. The police officers, they totally violated the First Amendment. And I don't know, because that was a new area and arena that they stepped into. They had never experienced anything like it. Right. But you talking about militarization at its highest level. They told individuals that you can no longer assemble here. We're going to put a safe zone where that's where you go. And if you decide to come outside of that safe zone, you're going to jail. Okay? It was appalling to see, the injustice and the disrespect of the First Amendment with law enforcement.
We also talk about the University of Missouri. The story is that there was some racial discrimination going on the university campus, and I'm going to get to student activism in a minute. And one of the students, it was a black male student, went on a hunger strike in order to protest some of the racial discrimination or racial bad practices that were going on, and some of the lack of response from the higher up officials and directors of the programs. What is your, not necessarily opinion, but experience with what's going on now that a lot of student activism is taking place in Missouri?
We're dealing with a major issue throughout this country. A lot of young folks are ready to rise up, and they're rising up, and they want to see change. With what happened on the grounds of MU, the young man, they had racial slurs, They had racial slurs attack.
And verbally
racial attacks verbally.
Correct.
And they were sick and tired of it, and so they went to the administration and they asked the administration to do something. The administration, they didn't do anything, okay? And so the young man said, listen, if you're not going to listen to our concerns and try to change the dynamics here on campus, then I'm going to go on a hunger strike. And he did just that. And so 2 days later, I received a call from one of the students that's a part of the 1950. Okay. And they said, listen, he's, this young man, he's on a hunger strike. It's been 3 days. He's going to die. I said, no, tell him to go pick up a book by Dick Gregory. Dick Gregory understands how important hunger strikes are, and you can live, beyond 3 days. Yeah. I said, but what you need to do is call a press conference and call for the resignation of the president. And so they did just that. Mm-hmm. They started protesting all day and all night on campus. And I think the straw that broke the camel's back was when the football players decided that they were going to go into the pockets of the MU. And when they decided to strike with those young individuals, MU truly understood that we have to do something now. Either we're going to pay him $400,000 a year, or we're going to lose millions. And so they decided to, he decided to resign. And as a result of that, that was a great victory for the protesters.
Right.
But now, where do we go from here is the question. How do we rebuild? How do we bring MU back to where it used to be in terms of its fineness?
State Senator Bullard, how do you think Florida has reacted, and what is your personal experience with the interactions of some of the protest movements that have occurred here after Ferguson?
Well, you know, protest movements in Florida actually predate Ferguson. You know, the Dream Defenders who've become sort of an organization of relative national prominence cut their teeth post Trayvon Martin, you know, 31 days sitting in the capital of the state of Florida. But even before that, some of the leaders that ultimately organized Dream Defenders were right there when there was a protest over Martin Lee Anderson. And I say these names because folks need to understand, and this is one of the things that drives me crazy about Florida. Florida, and I say this as a state senator, so if you have recordings, feel free to quote me on it. But historically speaking, Florida has been one of the most racist states in the country. And what do I mean by that? I mean that. Well, no.
I don't know.
What I mean by that is, Florida, even during the height of lynchings, there was a greater possibility of being lynched in Florida than any other state in the South. That's what a lot of folks don't understand. When Alabama, Mississippi were getting all the attention, if you set foot in this state, you ran a greater chance of not coming out of it alive. And what ends up happening is this notion of Florida being kind of even-keeled, you don't have to worry about it, it's kind of a progressive / racist, whatever that means, state, is a misnomer, right? So once people get that in their mind, you have to understand sort of the pushback that ends up impacting a number of the protest movements. Then you think about Martin Lee Anderson, just a little backstory on that. This was a kid who was being held at a camp, a prison camp, if you will, and was choked to death by some of the guards. Those guards never saw a day in jail. That frustrates people. Again, bringing up Trayvon Martin. George Zimmerman still walks the streets. That frustrates people. You know, when the gentleman who shot Jordan Davis was convicted of attempted murder of the 3 people that lived, but not convicted of murder of the 1 person who died, that frustrates people. And so we're sort of akin to what's happening in Ferguson here in the state of Florida, because we have to use the Ferguson moment as a catalyst to make change here. And that's unfortunate because there's been multiple circumstances of racial injustice in Florida that are documented, that are understood, but there's been no national outcry that this has to change. So here's what I mean, and I'll sort of wrap it up with this, right? The same way we were able to lift up Ferguson, as Senator Rasheed tells the story about being able to make those changes in law, there was no similar rising tide for us here in the state of Florida. When we were screaming at the top of our lungs that it's time to change, stand your ground here in the state of Florida, it was just Florida folks talking. You know, people put on hoodies, people did other things, but that's the kind of thing, is that we have to take the moments that are happening in Missouri as an opportunity to make significant change to some of the laws and problems that we're facing here in Florida. And we need law students
There's some around
to be there to help us out, because protest movements need organization. There could have been no Dr. King had Thurgood Marshall not been doing his work on the other side.
And before I ask a couple final questions, if anyone in the audience has any question, there is a mic set up back here before we wrap up this part of the program and move on to the next presenter. Senators, my final question is, what are some solutions and recommendations in an official capacity that maybe you guys can bring to the table, or are considering bringing to the table, so that we're able to understand some of the things that we need to be vocal about as students and as American citizens?
Well, one demand that, being that we have individuals rising up against systematic racism throughout campuses all over America right now. I think one of the demands that should be on the table right now is student loan debt.
I agree.
You know, I mean, that is like,
We have to clap to that.
If you have the ear of President Obama, I mean, where he's responding to Mizzou and, you know, the Justice Department, then I think that throughout the country, that should be one of the biggest demands right now while you have the ear of every politician in the United States of America, even those that are running for president. Student loans debt, we need to rein in on student loans debt immediately, and it should be a major demand right now.
I agree.
Well, I'll piggyback on that by simply saying when you think about things like student loans or what I've written down, voting rights or economic injustice, understand that it all carries over. Here's what I think Senator Rasheed was alluding to. When someone is saddled with almost insurmountable debt, that stifles your voice as a protest because you're more concerned about making sure you make that minimum payment and not losing that job than you are about the concerns of others. And so the system that ultimately keeps people oppressed, all people, regardless of race, right, silent, is able to keep moving because it's able to constantly make you think that you're working your way out when you're really not. You know what I mean? Like you'll get your job as a, you know, you'll get
Hopefully you'll get a job.
Hopefully you'll get a job,
Hopefully
right?
we'll get a
but let's say you get your job clerking, or you get your job as a, you know, public defender or a state attorney, or even if you're working for a private firm, and you'll be so content that you'll fail to realize how jacked up the system is. So I'll give you an example of what our public defender here in the 11th Judicial Circuit is talking about. He's talking about the idea that the justice system impacts poor people most negatively. How is that? By putting in a system of fines and fees that poor people can't pay. So by law, you're too poor to get a private attorney, so you get a public defender. Someone then tells you to plea out and pay a fine of $1,500. I didn't have enough to get a retainer for a real attorney, but now you think I have $1,500 to pay, and then they say, well, if you can't pay it within this time, you now have to do time. And that's on your record. And that creates this vicious cycle of unemployability, and the cycle of poverty continues. You know, all that requires a level of intervention by folks who have a level of sanity. But also for those in the room, because you all are the privileged folks who are attending a great institution and being able to get a level of understanding. But I can tell you right now, just based on 2014 statistics, everybody from my legislative assistant that way, Terrell, wave your hand so they know what I'm talking about, right? Everyone from my legislative assistant that way didn't vote. Period. You know, in terms of per 100 people, everybody on that side chose to stay home, who was eligible, who was registered. And then we sit there and wonder why laws keep impacting us in a negative way. You know, so I'm going to, again, jump on this bandwagon. Everyone says, does voting change things? Yes. Voting ultimately changes things.
I agree.
But lack of voting also changes things. And so when you're sitting there mad at the world about not getting the candidate of your choice running a particular race, I can tell you it's better to play defense than have to always be on offense. Because I promise you this, you get the wrong person in office and they will make your life miserable. I can tell you that because our governor is that kind of person, right?
Okay. I worked with him too, so you know. We have a question from the audience. What's your name? And then you can go ahead.
My name is Mike Jones, and how do you claim that student loan debt is a problem when the entire problem is that education is a good? It has a cost and a value. And by trying to infantilize students' decisions with a student loan and taking on money they're borrowing knowingly, you're only making their economic intelligence lower and making the problem more severe and increasing the fact that colleges have nothing but an incentive to increase costs and raise prices, particularly when you forgive that debt or you pay it on their behalf.
So the question
is, why do you think it's an issue when...
That's a great question. However, all too often, individuals were told to knock on the doors of opportunity, that education is the key that opens the doors of opportunity. They come out, and we see it time and time again. They come out with student loan debt that they cannot pay, okay? They're not able to find a job to pay the student loans because you know and I know with the Great Recession, the economy just went up in flame. So they're not able to find jobs. And what you find is individuals working a 9 to 5 at $30,000 a year when they got out of school, they were supposed to make $80,000 to $90,000 a year. And so I'm saying we know that that's happening. So at some point we have to figure out, if we know that those are the dynamics, we have to figure out how we can reduce the amount of student loans or debt that those individuals who are going to school are having to pay back. And that's what I'm saying.
Okay, and I think we have a question back there.
How you doing? My name is Denzel Burnside. I'm a social justice advocate for the Miami-Dade area. Proud to see you, a senator from Missouri. I'm very excited to hear the work that you're doing afterwards. I work a lot with black youth in terms of social justice from FIU, UM, and so forth. And it's very interesting to hear the young man's statement in reference to student loan debt, because one of the biggest problems that we're having here, especially at Florida Memorial, UM, and so forth, is trying to connect those segmented communities to understand that there is a global problem that's taking place amongst young minorities. And one of the questions that I'm trying to figure out, as it were, and maybe more so to the individuals who are in this room who are pursuing higher level education degrees and so forth, is what is it going to take for people to have an empathetic stance? Because I do this all the time like you do. I go to forums, I pop off, I yell, and then behind that I have to educate young youth how to be able to take this emotional conversation and push it into a policy conversation, which is where we lose at. And the biggest problem I see in all of these movements when I go to these forums, and no shade to Gene Defenders or any of those organizations, is that we do really well with the yelling and the screaming, and I say it all the time, black people as well as my Hispanic brothers and sisters, we do have a really good way of, like I say, a long-term pain, but very short-term memory. And what's scary to me is that here it is in this room right now, the opposite of what the senator just said in reference to the voting age. We're not seeming to be able to get young youth to be engaged, as well as our counterparts in white communities to be able to say, look, all we're looking for most times is for you to be able to check the guy that's in the circle that we can't talk to and tell him you're dumb as hell. And look at the situation from another lens. So how do you, I guess, policy that type of behavior?
Well, I think one of the things, and I appreciate the question, is you take the intelligence in the room, right? All right. So by a show of hands, who here is a college student currently,
Well,
or has graduated?
law students are in college too, kind of. So.
All right. And law school, who are my law school participants? All right. So here's what's crazy. Here's what's crazy about this is we have a lack of policy initiatives from a progressive standpoint. So all this chaos is happening, right? And we're all sort of screaming, yelling, and being upset about what's happening. And then when it comes to how do we make changes to actual statute that impact, no one's doing the reading of the statute. So all of you have a law library or access to one, and you might see a law on the books that is clearly asinine and antiquated, but no one's proposing a change to that law. I'll give you a prime example. On the books of the Florida state statute up until 2011 was the Chinese Exclusion Act. We had not eradicated that from state statute until 2011. Not to say that it was being enforced, but the idea that it was still in the books means that for all the lawyers that have come through the legislative process, no one thought it problematic to say, you know what, this might be the law we should get rid of. You know, but it's those kinds of things, you know, that we have to be mindful of, and we need you all to do it. I mean, we love to sit there and comb through the statutes every year to see what do we take out or what do we tweak. But there has to be it can't just be the job of the Center for American Progress or handful of other organizations to come up with policy notions, because they're money-driven policy organizations. You all have skin in the game as future lawyers.
Right.
So let's make some policy change.
Absolutely. I want to thank both of the senators for being here. They're going to stick around and answer questions or talk to any of you guys that are willing. Oh, you have a question back there? All right.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Carmen Jimenez. Don't you think, panel, don't you think that we can exercise our right to protest through resolutions? I mean through city resolutions or county resolution or state resolution, instead of going out there and disturb the other people's peace? Thank you.
I don't think it's an either or thing. I think it's everything has got to be on the table. If you go to your city and you get a resolution passed, that's phenomenal. But, and the senator can attest to this, I'm sure in our own state, we have this thing called local preemption. If you've never heard of the term, get used to it, because it's something that the state of Florida likes to do to local government by basically saying local government can't make a law that in any way impacts or supersedes state law. And so what they'll sit there and say is, oh, you want to clean up your environment? Sorry, we won't do that. And the reason I bring that up is because currently everyone talks about plastic bag use or environmental impact. Currently, state law prohibits individual cities from banning plastic bags in the state of Florida.
Interesting.
So you can't do it. So even if you are on Miami Beach and wanted to say, let's reduce the use of plastic bags, by state law, you cannot do that. So it definitely impacts your ability to protest when local preemption becomes a tool that state government uses to create a death blow to your protest movement.
Okay, I want to say thank you to the senators for this portion of the show, and I think the answer to the question was both of them, even if you have to disturb some people, just because right now at the current moment, protest movements may be a little alarming for us, or we hear the word protest, we're thinking nonviolence or violence or rioting, looting, but as we mentioned earlier, the power of a voice, implementing change through policy, through protest movements. Protest movements have been in our history for a long time. And I want everyone to give a hand to the senators and thank you guys for answering questions. Our next presenter is our very own LLM student here, and he's also an attorney and professor in Venezuela. He's going to talk about the contrasting view to the United States First Amendment right, which is the right to resistance in Venezuela. Everyone give a hand to Mr. Rafael Dominguez.
Well, I would like to say thank you to St. Thomas University and the International Law Review for this excellent idea of the symposium and the opportunity to use this space of knowledge to discuss important topics that are happening in our countries. And especially I want to say thank you to Professor Wisner and Professor Apari for giving the opportunity to be with you in this afternoon and talk about Venezuela. Before I start, I really like the name of this symposium. You know, when a government, when a regime is anti-democratic, or sometimes they can put on jail people, sometimes can kill people, but our voice never and never could be silenced for the government and always be free. I think that this is a very important issue. Is one of the ways that we can express our situation in our country. And this panel, this outstanding panel, and every one of you, I want you to say thank you for being here. And the issue which I'm going to talk is about right to resistance, with a special emphasis in domestic law in Venezuela. Before we discuss about what happened in Venezuela, I would like to reflect a briefly definition and historical and philosophical perception about the right to resistance in a general way. The right to resistance, yes, it's a right, but it's not just a right. It's a duty. You know, it's an obligation, it's a moral obligation that we have, that all the people have in a nation to go against the government that their acts are against the human rights. This right has been used through history to justify many revolutions, including American Revolution and French Revolution. We can find and we can talk about right to resistance or jus resistendi, like it is in Latin. We can find in many texts, such as the English Carta Magna of 1215 and the Hungarian Golden Volume in 1222. We can talk about philosophers since St. Thomas. We can talk about John Locke, how Professor Wisnet said. We can talk about Rousseau. We can talk about Kant. Until today, this concept is not a new concept. This concept has been developed for many, many years. And I think this concept is not just the right to resistance. It's like a senator said, it's the right to protest. It's the right that we have to manifest our voice. When we talk about historical perception, we have to talk about American Revolution. And when we talk about American Revolution, we have to search into the Declaration of Virginia in 1776 and the Declaration of Independence in the United States. And the idea of the right to resistance, the idea of the right to resist in the independence of the United States was the base, and was and we found the inspiration and new revolutions with the same idea like the French Revolution. I want to read an article 35 of the Declaration of the Man and Citizens that said, when the government violates the people's right, the insurrection is for the people, and for each portion of them, the most sacred of rights and the most important of the duties. In this order of ideas, I want to talk briefly about John Locke, Immanuel Kant, and Karl Marx. When we talk about Locke said that the people hold a right to revolt against a tyrannical government. But this right to revolt, like Professor Wisner said, we only have to use into the civil society from the state of nature in order to protect this right, life, liberty, and property. And the right to resistance acts as safeguard against tyranny and abuse of the power by the state. Against him, Immanuel Kant said that the right to revolution is illusion, because for Kant, the idea of right to revolution is incoherent and incompatible with the supreme authority of the state. A regime for Kant is always legitimate. But ironically, Kant support French Revolution. And sometimes the words, in your words can say something, but in acts you do different things. For Karl Marx, the right to resistance is different to these two philosophers, because he talked about the proletariat, the lower class, and he said that the revolution is one of the enormous majority in the interest of the enormous majority, and the right to revolt is necessary for the emancipation of the oppressed working class. Thank you. Well, now we are going to talk about Venezuela. In Venezuela, to discuss about right to resistance, we don't need to go on the historical perception. We don't need to go to philosophical perception. We only have to take our constitution, go to the last article, and read it. For us, maybe it's easiest in the theory. And what said our Article 350? Said, the people of Venezuela, true to the republican tradition and their struggle for independence, peace and freedom, shall disown any regime, legislation, or authority that violate the values, democratic principles, and guarantees or encroach upon human rights. Well, this is theory. Now we are going to talk about practice. This controversial article has its own story in the social and political framework in Venezuela. And the story began in 1992, when Hugo Chavez, member of the army in Venezuela, tried to overthrow the democratic government of Carlos Andrés Pérez. But how did it start here? Well, 6 years after, Hugo Chavez won the elections, and a year after created a new constitution. In 1999 was published the new constitution with this Article 350 that was incorporated only with the only reason to justify the coup of 92. And that's the reason why we have this article in our constitution. He tried to justify what he did in 1992. But ironically too, Hugo Chavez and now Nicolás Maduro never thought that this article will be invoked by the opposition against themselves. And now is the most important legal support that the Venezuelan protests have against the regime. But the problem in Venezuela is not the constitution, it's not the law. We have a big problem. We don't have separation of powers. And this is the main point in all the right to resistance in Venezuela. Because we don't have alternative. We don't have the executive power of the president. They has kidnapped the powers. The judicial power and the legislative is subordinate to the president and the executive. And well, I'm a lawyer and a professor in my university, and it's difficult when you are in front of your student and they said, well, what we can do? Because the first option, if I think like a lawyer or is going to think is, well, go to the court, go do the domestic law. Is the first option that you have. Well, we went to the Supreme Court many times. And you know what? I'm going to read what the president of the judicial power said. I'm sorry. She said that the judicial power has engaged with the revolution, and they can permit any action against the regime. If the president of the Supreme Court said that, you don't have more options. You don't have option to go to the court. Well, second options. Professor Aparea, Professor Wisner said that go to the international court, go to the international systems, go to the international organization. Well, we did. We went. We went to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. We went many times. And you know what? They took the case, they solved the case, and they made recommendations. And you know what the regime said? This is an international conspiracy against Venezuela. And this is the Americans, the gringos, against Venezuela. And in 2013, after 25 recommendations and many claims into the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and the Committee of Human Rights, Venezuela decided to withdraw the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. We can go now. We can't go until Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Well, but you have a third option. You have many others. Organization, international organization, regional organization. You have OES. Yes, we OES. We went to OES. We went to OES in 2014. And in 2014, thank you to Panama, invite the opposition to Venezuela to talk about the problem that Venezuela had in this moment. And the OES vote 22 against 11 with one abstention said that this is a domestic problem. We can discuss about domestic problem in OAS. And we prefer don't talk about that and put out of our schedule. That happened in OAS. Well, go to UN. Yes, we went to UN too. And to make the long story short, yesterday, our president, he was in UN, and in the Committee of Human Rights of UN, and he said that Venezuela is the country that most respect human rights. Yes, because you can say whatever you want. But the problem is not what you say. The problem is what you do. And Venezuela was re-elected yesterday for 3 more years in the Committee of Human Rights of UN. And now we are in the Security Council of UN too. The opposition, we don't have many options, really. But it's not just there. In Venezuela, for me, the right to resistance is the only alternative that we have. We don't have many options. We don't have opportunity to solve our problem, not in domestic law, not in international law. But what is happening in Venezuela? Why we have to talk about right to resist in Venezuela? Why we have to talk about right to protest in Venezuela? Well, this is what happened in Venezuela. In the last 60 years, 1999 to 2015, over 252 people has been killed. More than any of the wars that are being developed in the actuality, and almost twice of the war in Iraq. In Venezuela, now, if you want to buy food, you have to be in lines for hours, and have to be the lock that has not ended when it's your turn. Sick people in Venezuela don't get the medicines, and public hospital has not the equipment to meet the needs of the people. Venezuela has the highest inflation in the world. This year is calculated in more than 200%. But on the other hand, in the last decade, Venezuela has received the most important income in the history of the country. Now, let me tell you a personal experience about right to resistance. Because it's easy to talk about right to resistance here in this auditorium with the smart people, with professors, with the law students, with a JD, LLM, with an outstanding panel that we have. But the last person who invoked the right to resistance in Venezuela, like a legitimate and democratic right and constitutional right, now is in a military jail and has been there for 1.5 years and will be there, according to the judge and the sentence, for 13 more years. That's the reason why it's easy for me to talk about right to resist here. The Joe Date in Venezuela in 2014, a movement of the civil society led by Leopoldo Lopez, came to protest against the regime of Nicolás Maduro for the reason that I give above. The result of this pacific and democratic exercise was 43 people killed, 1,000 people injured, 4,000 prisoners, 2 of them majors, community leaders, student representatives, and today 98 continue in arbitrary detention, awaiting a sentence from 8 to 15 years in prison for protest against the government. In Venezuela, it should be great that the people and civil society could go to the domestic court, the Supreme Court, and find remedy and solution to the crisis. But we don't have, how I say before, we don't have this option. We have to protest. We have to go to the street. we have to do what I have to do, because the democratic principles is more than the obligation that we have with our country, and our liberty and our human rights we have to protect in any ways. The thing about right to resist is not just what we have to do, it's how we have to do. And in Venezuela, we have 14 years protesting. We have 14 years see our friends in jail. We have 14 years see family divide, people emigrate to the country. We have problems that we never have. We don't have food. We don't have medicines. We have now problem with our neighborhood, Venezuela, Colombia, Guyana. And I love my country. I really love my country. And I want to be there. I don't want to talk about right to resistance in Venezuela, because we are a spectacular country. But now we have a very bad government. Then we try to change. In 20 days, we have one of the most important elections in Venezuela. We have the election to try to change the parliament. But you know what? The government changed the election rules two months ago. And now, if the opposition took the 65% of the vote, they only have the 40% of the parliament. I know that I have to conclude, but it's 15 years to oppress. Today, again, thank you to St. Thomas for permit that I can use my right to resist. Thank you to the coordinator of LLM and the Intercultural Law Review for permit to talk about our voice. It's not just my voice. It's more than 30 million people voice. And I ask all of you in the exercise of the international solidarity, my international student colleagues, the Americans, all please contribute with the power of your voice to provide support and hope to people of Venezuela to resist against anti-democratic government that don't respect our human rights. Your voice in your country speaks louder than our voice inside Venezuela. Everyone knows what happened in Venezuela. Please don't wait until it's too late. The international community has to turn their look into Venezuela and make international pressure to restore democratic values in my country. I want to conclude this initiative thinking, I can conclude without talk about Gandhi and Martin Luther King, how the senator said, and both they start with the power of their voice. Today, our voice can be the beginning of a great movement around the world. And maybe today, we are writing the new pages of the national history in Venezuela. Thank you all of you for your attention, but more thank you for your voice. We need it.
Thank you so much, Rafael. Rafael was also, and he didn't get to talk about this, but he was also a political prisoner as well in Venezuela. Or not a political prisoner, where was Friends, yeah. Okay. He didn't get to tell his personal account, but before we go on break, we're going to go on break in about 5 minutes. I just wanted to bring up another JD student. Well, he's an LLM student, Laura Pereira, who is also an editor on our law review. She's going to talk about Cuba and some of those contrasting views as well with America. Laura Pereira.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here standing next to such prestigious speakers and scholars. Thank you so much for being here. As Astra said, I'm going to be speaking today in regards to Cuba and the Cuban social movements that have been taking place. Cuba is a one-party state governed by the Cuban Communist Party. Its legal system limits both political and civil rights, such as freedom of assembly, expression, and not to mention economic and social rights. When citizens in Cuba oppose the Cuban government, they are seen as going against the Cuban government as a broader conspiracy. And the actions the Cuban government takes to compel political conformity include torture, detention, imprisonment, and other types of psychological manipulation. And they justify this as means of security rationale. But in order to understand the background of the lack of fundamental human rights in Cuba today, we have to talk about its constitution. Its constitution is composed of 137 articles with several wonderful provisions about equality and human rights. However, a lot of the provisions would offend anyone who is a lover of the First Amendment of the United States of America's Constitution. We have here Article 53. Article 53 states, citizens have freedom of speech and of the press in keeping with the objectives of socialist society. So you have freedom of speech, you have freedom of expression, as long as it abides by the Cuban Communist Party. Goes on to, then there are other articles, such as Article 54. It says, you have the right of assembly, you have the right to demonstrate, and associate yourselves with who you please. However, you cannot do this contrary to the existence and objectives of the socialist state, or contrary to decisions of the Cuban people to build socialism and communism. Violations of this principle can be punished by law. So do you really have freedoms? No, you don't. It completely contradicts itself. So in reality, verbal criticism, which it is in everyday Cuban homes, is not itself a felony, but people who create problems for the Cuban government are excluded from participating in society. They can be subject to losing their jobs, to losing benefits, their families, food, which is rationed and barely any. But these repressive techniques create a climate of fear that have a profound limitation on their exercise of fundamental freedom rights, of rights. Besides this, there are brave men and women in Cuba, and there are several areas of civil activism. One in specific that I want to highlight today is the Black Spring. The Black Spring took place between March 18th and March 24th of 2003, and this is when the Castro government detained a total of 75 government dissidents. Out of those 75, 29 of those were journalists. All the journalists were found guilty after one day of trials. These dissidents were simply trying to fight for their human rights. The Cuban government says that they were damaging Cuba's territorial integrity and economy, and they handed down sentences ranging from 14 to 30 years. But out of this movement came the Ladies in White. The Ladies in White, are also known as Las Damas de Blanco, are a dissident group of women in Cuba who engage in forms of civil disobedience in opposition to Fidel and Raúl Castro's regime. They have organized themselves. On a weekly basis, the Cuban ladies march peacefully in the city of Havana. They carry a flower of their choice and the pictures of their family members who are political prisoners. Then they meet for mass at a local church. One of these events, on March 17, 2010, one of their peaceful marches ended abruptly when the Cuban government officials violently removed them from the streets, as you will see in this video. Should have sound button. Here you see them marching, and then taken to a bus to prison. The international community was quick to respond, and the ladies' message spread widely, and within 4 months, several of their family members were released from jail. The day after this event took place, the ladies were not stopped in their movement, and they continued to march. As of 2014, the Ladies in White have expanded their memberships not only to Havana City, but also to 11 other provinces in Cuba, and have over 265 members, which is incredible because the limitations that these people in Cuba have are incredible, and just voicing your opinion can mean being taken away your food or your family's benefits. But another important organization that took place, that was organized after the Black Spring, was La Unión Patriótica de Cuba, otherwise known as the Patriotic Cuban Union, or UNPACU. UNPACU is a group of nonviolent human rights activists who are struggling for freedom and basic rights for all Cubans. It was started by a prisoner called José Daniel Ferrer, prisoner of conscience. He started the organization as a result of his arrest during the Black Spring. This organization has continued to grow in numbers and influence, increasing their presence online and in social media despite the limited access of the internet in Cuba. In February, you see right here to your left, 50 members of the Santiago-based opposition group of the UNPACU were sent to prison for several years, and people are still protesting in order to get them out. But it's important to talk about the internet in Cuba. Cuba is considered the least connected country in the Americas, with the Geneva-based ITU ranking them 125th out of 166 countries. In the decades since the internet's arrival in Cuba, the internet has allowed citizens to escape the grip of the regime and create a new public sphere of uncensored debate. Although it is very hard to find, and an hour of internet in Cuba costs $5, and to the humble Cuban, that is a lot of money, they still find ways to get on the internet. Bloggers and journalists provide substance, in-depth reporting on all aspects of Cuban life, such as political prisoners, government repression, and socioeconomic issues. One in particular I wanted to highlight today was Joanny Sanchez, who launched 14 y Medio, Havana's first independent digital daily, and she has more than 1 million followers on Twitter, and a lot of them are Cuban. The internet connects the world and gives space for freedom of speech and connectivity. And there's a strong hope that Cuba can enter this global conversation and use it as a tool to find new solutions to its problems and new ways of freedom and new ways of finding ways to protest. Important to note is the reestablishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. And with this comes many hopes to the Cuban people and their desire for democracy. The desire for democracy comes from the need and want to freely determine their own future. So I leave you with this, a quote by Joanny Sanchez, the blogger and journalist. Freedom is fundamentally the possibility of standing on a street corner and shouting, "There is no freedom here." Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Laura. Here goes the clicker. Okay, we're going to take a little 5 to 10 minute break. There will be food, wine, everything is free. Enjoy. We'll reconvene in 10 minutes and have amazing presentations by my co-editor-in-chief moderating. All right.
It looks like we have a slightly smaller crowd now. There will be more food later, so if you didn't get full on the snacks, there's more later. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and continue, and more people will filter in the next couple of minutes. So now we are moving on to the root causes of protests in the international community. We're going to give you a broad spectrum of different regions that are experiencing widespread protesting right now, all the way from Central America to Southern Africa. So first up, we have Sarah Hager, who is with Amnesty International with the Southern Africa Co-Group Researchers. Sarah.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome and thank you to St. Thomas University for the invite. Let me make sure I don't screw this up. Woohoo! Technology. Freedom of assembly. So in international law, it's codified in 2 places. The Universal Declaration for Human Rights, which is one of the founding documents of the United Nations. It was soft law for a very long time because it was not a treaty. So that meant that it was not binding on anybody's behavior. However, it has now moved into customary law due to practice and acceptance. But what is binding now and was from the beginning is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That came into effect in 1976 when it was ratified by enough states to come into force. And so those are the protections that you have under international law for freedom of assembly. So colonial occupation protests took many forms. We often know of the wars that people engaged in to remove the yoke of colonialism, but people also engaged in mass protest. The wave of independence that we saw first started in 1957 with Ghana, and 1960 was the year that we saw a pretty large cascade of states achieving independence. But however, there was no colonial authority at that time that had ratified the covenant. So individuals who were brave enough to take to the streets didn't have any sort of protections or recourse. So when you look at what it was that they were facing, that adds an extra element to the courage that it took to get out onto the streets. And you can see the protest took many forms, including even protests to keep colonial rule. Perhaps the most well-known protest was the anti-apartheid protest that took place in South Africa over close to 3 decades, and eventually became international scope, as the senator referenced. These protests took the form of either mass street protests, or they would just gather in a place to chant and make known what their grievances were. But if you look at the pictures and the images to what's going on nowadays, they're hauntingly similar. The fashion changes, but that's about it. So some of these images are from Fees Must Fall, which is the protest movements that we recently saw in South Africa over the last month. What's also the same is the governmental response. So you see in the image below from the Sharpeville massacre in South Africa in 1860, that included fighter jets to try to disperse the crowds, as well as tear gas, and eventually shootings. The Fees Must Fall movements, you see large amounts of people on the street peacefully protesting, and you see the police responding with violence and force. This image was viral during the Fees Must Fall protests. A mother texting her child, telling him or her how to deal with the tear gas. And what's most memorable to me about it is that at the end she says, "I really didn't expect to have to be teaching my children this." Unfortunately, she did. And so you see the images of the tear gassing, and then above from Sharpeville. But South Africa is not the only country in the region that has been protesting. One of my favorites is Women of Zimbabwe Arise. These women are amazing and inspiring. They're a movement that began in 2003, and they started around Valentine's Day and have adopted the rose as their symbol because they looked at what was happening around Valentine's Day and the idea of love, and they couldn't understand why their government didn't have that same feeling towards them. And so their goal is to empower women to engage in politics and to not be afraid to stand up and raise their voice. Unfortunately, the government also responds in Zimbabwe in a similar fashion with militarization in the streets, beatings, attacking. They've beaten grandmothers, they've beaten women who are holding children. And Zimbabwe actually has freedom of assembly codified in its constitution. It doesn't necessarily matter, as you see with what's happening, but it is codified in their constitution. They are also a signatory of the Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. The only country in the sub-Saharan region that is not a signatory of the covenant is South Sudan. It's a brand new country, and they're slightly occupied with other things at the moment rather than ratifying international treaties. So the founders of WOZA, Jenny Williams, she personally has been arrested over 50 times. So you can see that exercising your rights to freedom of assembly in Zimbabwe is a bit of an issue. The most recent instance that we've been having to try to address is the disappearance of Itai Dzamara. So Itai was the founder of the Occupy Africa movement. And so he got activists to stand in a park outside near the official offices of the President Mugabe, and they would do protests on a regular basis. And he was a bit of the fly in the ointment for President Mugabe. He delivered a petition to his offices demanding that he step down from power, and eventually they disappeared him, which was a tactic that we had seen quite often in Zimbabwe, but we'd all gotten a little complacent because it hadn't happened in a few years, actually. But on that date, March 9th, a group of plainclothes men approached him in a white pickup truck, that they called Baki, grabbed him, bundled him into the pickup truck, were loudly making weird random statements like, "You stole a cow," as if that was justifying why they were taking him, and he has not been heard from since. So Amnesty International has been working on his case quite vigorously at that time, and since that time. Activists are often forced to be very creative. So WOZA, Women of Zimbabwe Arise, one of their tactics is they will pick the target of their demonstration, the government office that they're delivering their petition or their grievance to, but they'll have their different groups of activists, and they'll frequently gather 300 to 500 women and men to participate in their protests. And they will have them approach from different ways. And so if one group is violently dispersed and pushed away by the police, at least one group has a chance to make it to the target and deliver their petitions. One thing that we've also seen quite a lot is the use of flash mobs as protests. So WOZA had done that a little bit as well, but who really has sort of solidified it and used it quite a bit is in Angola. So these started around 2012. Angola has experienced a pretty severe decline in their economy, and their war veterans were not getting paid. And so they took to the streets along with youth who, as we see, youth are often one of the impetuses of these protest movements. And so they would coordinate these protests to have a chance to get into the street. And so there would be 5 to 15 people who would meet at different places around Luanda, the capital, and some other cities, Bangui and other places. They would protest for about 5 minutes, and then they would scatter before the police could come and violently disperse them. In Luanda, they have used dogs, batons, and other means to violently disperse protesters, including the disappearance of 2 activists that was later, the government admitted that state agents had grabbed them in and murdered them. They also used it as a form of solidarity during the trial of Rafael Marques de Moraes. Rafael is a journalist in Angola, and he was convicted this year of slanderous denunciation, which is not something that we have here in the U.S., but he was convicted. It was related to a book that he wrote accusing military generals of corruption and human rights abuses in the diamond industries. And they were not necessarily happy with him, and so he went on trial and was convicted. And the protesters would gather outside of his house around 8 or 9 o'clock at night for a few minutes and shout in solidarity for Rafael, and then would disperse because they didn't want the police to come and either arrest them or get Rafael in trouble. But it was a way that they could show solidarity with Rafael and let him know that he was not standing alone in his battle. The Angola 15 is a group of individuals that are going on trial on Monday. They are, Luwadi Barao is the gentleman here. He is one of the organizers of this flash mob protest concept. And as a group of individuals, they had been meeting regularly to discuss nonviolent means to introduce change into their government. The government decided that they didn't like that and arrested them. They've been in jail since June. Luwadi has then, at one point, he was engaged in a hunger strike. He made it for 36 days. And then he finally conceded to feedings because he has a 7-month-old daughter, and his wife finally said, "Look, dude, like, you made your point." But he was able to really coalesce a large amount of international attention around this case due to the efforts of his hunger strike, which is another means of peaceful protest that we saw, as was discussed in the Missouri case. Some of the bravest activists in Africa are those who participate in pride parades. Homosexuality is criminalized on much of the continent. Not every state enforces those, Even states like Zimbabwe, where you get President Mugabe, who calls gay people dogs and all other sorts of horrible things that he says, people really aren't prosecuted for for homosexuality very often. There was a politicized case just recently, but the person was acquitted. But in Uganda, which many people are probably aware is one of the most repressive and violent states towards gay people, they have had gay pride parades for the last 2 years. And South Africa had them for almost 10 years now. And even in South Africa, which has decriminalized homosexuality and has legalized gay marriage, there's still a lot of social stigma to being gay. So it still takes a lot of courage to get out on the street and participate in a gay pride parade. So exercising your right to peaceful protest is clearly a dangerous proposition. And so you might want to ask, why are people doing it? Because it sometimes works. We have definitely seen it here in the US, and it can take a long, slow time, but it works. And people are angry and people are upset and they feel a need to express themselves. So a lot of the protest movements that we've seen in the last few years in Africa have had to do with presidential term limits. Africa has a governance problem, to say the least, with term limits. President Dos Santos has been in office for 27 years, and he's beaten by, I believe it's Equatorial Guinea, by like 30 days, something like that. Robert Mugabe is 91 and has been in office for a ridiculous amount of time. And so what we're seeing is that there are constitutional limits in place in several countries, but presidents have been trying to introduce constitutional amendments to allow them to serve another term of power. And people have been taking to the streets and protesting that. With some success in Burkina Faso, Congo, Brazzaville, and Senegal, Burundi has disintegrated into a nightmare, but the impetus was the attempt of the president to initiate for another term of office. They also managed to serve to create international awareness about incidents, and that's often very beneficial. So what can activists do? They can go to court. So Woza sued the Zimbabwe government and won. They were arrested in a protest in 2008, and they were charged with disturbing the peace. And they filed a lawsuit stating that they were arbitrarily arrested because the police knew that they did not meet the parameters of the law under which they were arrested, and therefore they were deprived of their liberty and due process of the law. And the court agreed. They said the applicants were simply exercising their fundamental rights to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. What the applicants did was germane to the purpose for which the fundamental rights to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression are guaranteed under the Constitution. They did all they did in a peaceful gathering whilst preserving their willingness to act in conformity with the law. The acts they committed were acts to which the statute would not apply, as the conduct was wholly protected by the Constitution. So we have a legal victory, and it was big, because since then, the government, while they still arrest them, they have not detained them for any longer than a few hours. They've moved into a policy that we've called catch and release. So they have still been violently dispersing some of their protests, but not all, and they have been arresting some people at some of their protests. But they're only holding them for a few hours. They're not detaining them for weeks and days as they had done before this ruling. What is up for debate is the effect that this had on Itai Dzamara. What we saw about 2 years after this ruling was the Zimbabwe government utilizing the legal system in a different way. So the founders of WOZA were accused of kidnapping and theft in these really ridiculous charges, but it's a way to occupy somebody's resources, both financially, emotionally, mentally, as you're engaged in a very long, drawn-out court case. And so they found another way to persecute them through the legal system because they couldn't by detaining them and arresting them when they were out protesting. So we can't draw a straight line with what happened with Itai Dzamara. Did they disappear him because they felt they couldn't arrest them because this constitutional court ruling was sitting out there? Or would they have just done it anyway because it is part of the standard practice with which they've dealt with activists in the past? but it's a positive move forward, and this rule is on the books, and it has helped WOZA. There's also universal jurisdiction. So despite South Africa's recent mumblings about vacating from the ICC, which I personally don't think will happen, however, they have been very strong on utilizing universal jurisdiction. So the picture of the house in the top corner used to belong to the Zimbabwe government. It no longer does because a organization sued the, so they were, it's complicated, but so there was a court case, Zimbabwe farmers in the SADC tribunal won. The SADC tribunal was then disbanded, so they could not get further recourse. The South African courts said, but South Africa is part of the treaty to the South African development community, therefore we can enforce the ruling through universal jurisdiction. And so they seized the property and sold it, and the proceeds went to the Zimbabwe farmers to help satisfy some of their legal fees. They also recently stated that the South African Police Division, SAPS, and the National Prosecutor have the right to investigate incidences of torture in Zimbabwe because Zimbabwe was not willing to do it themselves. And so that was a pretty major ruling that said that, if a state is not willing to take care of its own citizens and investigate allegations of torture, then we'll do it on their behalf. So I'm about out of time, so I will run through this quickly, but there's also the African Commission on Human and People's Rights and the African Court on Human and People's Rights. So the court came into force in 2004. Only 27 states have ratified it. And there has been one case brought before the court as of this time on freedom of assembly, and it was dismissed for failure to pursue by the applicant. The applicant was the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. So to access the African Court, you can only access it if you are the African Commission or you are a member of the Treaty of the African Court, or if you are an observer to the African Commission, or you're an individual. This is kind of long and complicated, sorry. And the state has made a declaration allowing you to bring a case. So to get into the African Court is convoluted and challenging, and because of that, they have only received 28 applications for cases. So it's drastically underutilized, and there's potential there for cases to go forward. The African Commission has been around since 1987. They have made a lot of statements about freedom of assembly, and there is a working group on freedom of association that was brought in to include assembly. They have not yet released a final report, but this is where I have gotten into my research, is digging through the large body of what the African Commission has stated on freedom of assembly, and looking at how that can also be utilized. But these are very underutilized systems that I believe that African activists can move forward with to try to assert their legal rights to freedom of assembly.
All right, up next we have Lisa Maya Knauer, who will be talking a little bit about the protest movements in Guatemala.
Sorry. One of the things I like about doing research in Guatemala is that at 5 foot half an inch, I'm actually tall in the highlands. So, and I apologize when I was sending my PowerPoint. I had to cut it up into pieces because I'm a little old school on this, and it was really big because there are a lot of original photographs in it, which are huge. And a few slides got out of place. So there are a few places where it doesn't quite go along with the talk, but I hope you'll just be patient. In mid-April of this year, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, known by its Spanish acronym CICIG, the Comisión Internacional contra la Impunidad en Guatemala, an international watchdog organization established by the United Nations in the aftermath of a 36-year-long civil war that pitted a small guerrilla insurgency against a series of military regimes, issued a voluminous report detailing a massive corruption scandal in which millions of quetzales were being siphoned off from the National Customs Agency to line the pockets of state functionaries and their pals among the business elite. The revelation that there is corruption in Guatemala would normally not cause raised eyebrows. It would be greeted with something like Captain Renault, if you've seen the film Casablanca, he walks into Rick's and says, "I'm shocked that there's gambling in this establishment," as he picks up his take. Everyone knows that if you're stopped at a highway roadblock in Guatemala, if you slip a few bills to the police, they will overlook an expired or missing registration sticker. And some of us even think that that's why they set up the roadblock, so they have money to go buy their churrascos for lunch. In 2010, the U.S. Army War College issued a report detailing an intimate relationship between drug traffickers, gangs, and the Guatemalan military and police. But what struck a nerve about the April CSIG report was that the trail of breadcrumbs led to the door of the private secretary to Vice President Roxana Baldetti, whose party, the Partido Patriota, had come to power in 2012 on a law and order campaign, promising a hard hand, una mano dura, against crime and corruption. In fact, only a few months earlier, before this report, then President Otto Pérez Molina, a retired military officer, had tried once again to kick CICIG out of Guatemala, saying that it had outlived its usefulness. But suddenly, or so it seemed to many observers, people had had enough. Some disgruntled students and young professionals in the capital city, Guatemala City, found each other on Facebook, having posted messages about expressing their private outrage, and although none of them were politically active, they launched a call for citizens to gather on April 25th in the Plaza de la Constitución, the city and the country's main public square, smack in front of the Palacio Nacional, the National Palace, which is the Guatemalan equivalent of the White House and the Executive Office building rolled into one, under the hashtag Renuncia Ya, or resign already. Soon thousands of people had either liked the Facebook page or said they were going to the event. Much to the surprise of the mainstream media, the political class, and the organizers themselves, if we can even use the word organizers for people who are not connected to any social movement, over 40,000 people showed up, carrying hand-lettered signs demanding the vice president's resignation, and some demanding an overhaul of the entire political system. What was extraordinary was not only the peaceful assembly of thousands of citizens, most of them protest newbies, but that it didn't stop there. And in fact, one of the other hashtags that soon became popular was Esto apenas comienza, we're just getting started. The annual May 1st rallies and marches, less than a week later, took up the call for the government to resign, and soon a call went out over social media for another protest the following week, same time, same place. Drawing upon the Occupy Wall Street playbook, organizers used the hashtag 9M 9 de Mayo. And on May 8th, the tearful Roxana Baldetti resigned, proclaiming her innocence and her ignorance of what had happened. And that basically that was, I changed it here, but she claimed ignorance and therefore she was innocent. And the government stated the protest had nothing to do with her resignation. People turned out to celebrate her resignation and calling for the president to step down as well. But Pérez Molina was an officer and later a general during the Civil War, and he has been linked to acts of genocide and war crimes, although efforts to bring him to justice have so far failed. And protest signs and placards started to link impunity for government corruption with impunity surrounding the genocide. What had started out as an apparently spontaneous action by a largely non-indigenous urban middle class, and this is an important demographic observation in a country with one of the highest indices of income inequality in the hemisphere, and where concentrations of wealth and poverty largely hew to racial lines of non-indigenous and indigenous, which are roughly the same as the urban-rural divide. So this urban middle-class movement began to spread, and there were Renuncia Ya protests in other cities and towns, and even in more isolated rural communities. The diaspora communities also got into the picture quite literally. They organized small protests in cities like New York and Los Angeles with sizable Guatemalan immigrant populations, but thousands of others simply posed for selfies holding homemade placards and posted the photographs on social media. While pundits and periodistas were scrambling to analyze exactly where these protests had come from and where they were going, their nature had already started to shift. When I saw a photo on Facebook of a Maya Quiche woman I know from Olintepeque, an evangelical Christian who rarely leaves her bakery except to go to church or visit family, holding a placard with a hashtag slogan. It was her daughter's Facebook account. She doesn't use Twitter, and she doesn't really quite know what it is. I knew something was changing. The protests continued through the summer. I attended one on July 4th and also the following week, and ultimately succeeded in forcing the resignation of President Otto Pérez Molina, the first time in Latin American history that a president has voluntarily stepped down in response to citizen protests, and not because of a coup or machinations of the United States, like Jean-Bertrand Aristide in Haiti, which is a different story. The first media reports emphasized the urban and middle-class character of these unprecedented, and I'm using that word in quotes, protests, and the key role played by social media-savvy youth. But in fact, discontent with the national government had been simmering for years, even decades, although a series of brutal massacres starting in the late 1970s and the disappearance of student, union, peasant, and religious leaders during the armed conflict effectively decapitated, and sometimes quite literally, or disemboweled also quite literally, social movements and suppressed most visible manifestations of protest, of discontent during the years of military dictatorships, and even after the country returned to normal civilian rule. After the peace accords were signed in 1996, the government moved swiftly to bring back the overseas investors who had pulled back during the war, and one of the first major post-conflict laws was the Law de Minería, the mining law, creating extremely favorable conditions for transnationals. They lowered the tariff that was paid by transnational mining companies from 5% to 1%, basically giving the stuff away. Creating extremely favorable conditions for transnationals, and successive governments have granted hundreds of mining licenses. Following along this neoliberal path and under the banner of so-called development, the government has also opened the door to foreign investment in hydroelectric and biofuel projects. Many of these licenses are in indigenous communities, and in some cases, the exact same communities that were hard hit during the war, where there were massacres and entire villages basically wiped off the map. And since the early 2000s, indigenous communities have resisted these incursions against their territorial sovereignty, often grounding their claims on both international legal frameworks. I figured you guys were law students, so I'd throw in a little law here, such as the International Labor Organization's Convention 169 on the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples, and the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights of the Organization of American States, as well as more traditional usos y costumbres, uses and customs, which is kind of a rubric under which traditional pre-Columbian, pre-conquest law is defined. Indigenous communities have held grassroots referenda, consultas comunitarias, that have overwhelmingly rejected mining, dams, and other mega projects. The first consultas were in 2005, and to date there have been over 70. In addition, residents have blocked highways, organized marches, occasionally destroying machinery or torching a police station. Because these actions took place in the rural hinterlands, although the movements have garnered some international support, they remain largely invisible to the urban and political classes. Remember what I said earlier about the urban-rural divide. If it doesn't happen in Guatemala City, the middle and political classes don't know what's going on. But they were not invisible to the transnationals or their state partners. And since 2012, there has been an increasingly militarized response, very similar in some ways to what is going on in southern Africa, to these largely indigenous protests and a criminalization of their leadership. And the charges are equally ridiculous and trumped up. In May 2012, during the patron saint feast in Santa Cruz Barrias, Huehuetenango, where a Spanish transnational was constructing a hydroelectric dam against the wishes of the predominantly Canjobal Maya community, company guards shot 2 peasant leaders, one of whom died. The government declared martial law to quell the growing protests, and the army went house to house looking for leaders, arresting several and issuing arrest warrants for dozens more. A few months later, traditional authorities in the Maya Quiche municipality of Totonicapan blocked the Inter-American Highway to protest a series of government measures that adversely affected rural communities, including a restructuring of electricity rates. Something that we might think of as being a kind of class or race-neutral policy, right? Everybody needs electricity, but in fact it's not. The government sent the army, which opened fire on what was a peaceful protest, killing 8. In both of these cases, the social movements have made use of the internet, and those slides you'll find at the end of this talk because they migrated, and social media to garner support. Social media, particularly Facebook, has become increasingly important as a way of communicating with supporters and sympathizers. This is especially true in isolated rural communities that are literally off the map of the highly monopolized mainstream Guatemalan media. Barillas is a 12-hour bus ride from the capital, and paper copies of the daily newspapers usually arrive a day late if they arrive at all. The national press based in the capital rarely, sends correspondence to these out-of-the-way places. The government has also raided several community radio stations in indigenous communities. These often broadcast in indigenous languages, report on issues of indigenous rights, including disputes over mining and mega projects. Another tactic has been setting up encampments on the access roads to mines or hydroelectric projects. Residents maintain a 24-hour presence at the encampment with different communities some hours away in remote areas, taking turns for a day or a week at a time. Community groups, local businesses, and solidarity organizations, some in the global north, some in the capital, some university students, donate food and supplies. There is usually a gender division of labor, and in fact, in the one encampment that's only an hour away from the city, students at the National Public University, the Universidad de San Carlos, actually it's an hour away by bus, and a lot of students come and spend time for a day at a time at the encampment at the Resistencia Pacifica. There's usually a gender division of labor as women prepare food and often don't stay overnight for safety reasons. And given the preponderance of gender violence and sexual violence, it's probably not a bad idea. And there have been sexual assaults against women who have been leaders in the movement. And in the longer version of this that I'm going to write up for the journal, I will talk more about the gendered aspects of this. But I just wanted to gesture at that here. While men often come after working in the fields, the Resistencias Pacíficas are in rural areas where most people are poor subsistence farmers. So coming to the Resistencia Pacífica represents a sacrifice of sorely needed family labor to put in one's crops, to weed, and to take care of animals. The Resistencias Pacíficas are interesting in that they represent a transformative, prefigurative space, much like the Occupy movement. It's a very particular form of enacting community and performing solidarity. The Resistencia Pacífica called La Puya, which is about an hour outside of Guatemala City, is now in its 4th year. In addition to the physical suppression of these resistance movements, in Guatemala they prefer the term defenders of land and water, defensores de la tierra y del agua, or defensores de la vida y del territorio, the defenders of life and territory. The government and the companies have tried to discredit and weaken the movements by criminalizing their leadership. One of the founders of the Pozo Verde encampment, Minor Lopez, and here are the slides of the Facebook campaigns that went out. This is the man that we saw posing against the gate a few slides back, and here he is having been roughed up a little bit by the police and taken into custody. He was arrested this is actually less than a month after the previous photo was taken. I visited him, and then a month later he was taken into custody. There's a 24-hour police presence in front of the encampment at La Puya. At the same time that the protest started this spring, 2 Canjobal leaders from Santa Eulalia, a town near to Barillas, were arrested when they came to the capital to bring criminal charges against the town mayor for his aggressions against the resistance movement, aggressions that included taking out a firearm and shooting some people, one of whom subsequently died, and the closing of a community radio station. A month later, 3 leaders from Santa Cruz Barillas were arrested. All of those who are arrested are facing very serious criminal charges, which include kidnapping, femicide, which is killing women because they're women, and terrorism. So the picture is a complex one. Citizen protests brought down a government, but have not succeeded in producing electoral reform. And Otto Pérez Molina's hand-picked successor was elected in a landslide. People registered their protest by staying away from the polls, casting null or blank ballots, or by, in some ways, defacing their ballots. More people stayed away or cast protest votes than voted for the winner. The president-elect, and I just couldn't put up slides of him because these are just really too awful. He is a comedian, literally a comedian, whose stock in trade is blackface and redface, portraying the Maya as buck-toothed, illiterate, simple-minded idiots. And although he hasn't perform these acts recently. This was how he made his living before he decided to become a politician. And at the same time as the legal cases against resistance leaders drag on, there also have been some victories. Two Kankoba leaders who had been in jail in preventive detention for over 2 years were just released last week. And it remains to be seen, I think, whether the Renuncia Ya movement is actually able to become a social movement. As I was talking to Brother Denzel, I don't know if he's still here, about what happens to the Black Lives Matter movement, what happens to Occupy Wall Street, what happens to a social protest, and can a series of social protests actually become a social movement? And can these sort of scattered, resistances, which are very localized, and that's part of their strength, is that they're rooted in people's claim to that piece of land. The reason people are willing to, go to jail against the hydroelectric project in Barrias is because it's a sacred waterfall. Kanbalam, it is, a sacred site, and whether people are evangelical, Catholic, practice traditional Maya spirituality, they recognize that they have legitimate claims to that land. So people are really willing to, put themselves at stake. But so the local is a strong point, but is there a way in which that also keeps it fragmented? So I just have a lot of questions. And thank you very much for your patience.
Finally, to close out our program, we have Brian Fonseca, who's going to be talking to us about El Salvador and Honduras.
Thank you. So there are some really important disadvantages in speaking last. One, when following such a dynamic set of speakers, the bar is set exponentially higher. And two, I find myself sort of stuck between you and the next glass of wine, right? So I realize that I have to be pretty short and concise. At the same time, there is a benefit, a really key benefit to going last, and that is you can take the stage inspired by some tremendous thought-provoking comments. Let me start by thanking Astrid and Erica and the St. Thomas team for putting this together. I mean, very impressive. Yeah, please, a round of applause. If you guys can pull this off as students, I can't wait to see what you can do after you graduate, right? That's right. So this is a work in progress. And for the journal, I'm going to focus on analyzing El Salvador and Honduras. But for today, I want to focus just on Honduras. And so I want to take the opportunity to be a little thought-provoking here, right, and be a bit provocative, and perhaps generate some discussion, if not here due to time, certainly going forward. I'm going to talk about security, a topic that I consider to be very contentious, right, with respect to state-society relations. And unlike some of the other presentations today, in Honduras, social movements and public demands are empowering governments, right, in ways that can threaten human rights, if not checked. And so that's kind of what I want to focus on today. In 2013, Honduran President Juan Orlando Hernandez established the Honduran Military Police of Public Order, also known as PMOP. And PMOP has paid immediate dividends for a country that is in dire need of reduced violence and a security apparatus that can effectively combat transnational criminal organizations, gangs, and overall delinquency that seems to be threatening many citizens in Honduras. In fact, the president has gone so far as to pledge that he's planned to put a soldier on every corner in Honduras. However, the strengthening of a militarized institution, or the militarization of policing, to take on these roles has the potential to exacerbate already poor conditions within the state, right? So namely human rights abuses, impunity, and corruption. So while PMOP has shown short-term successes in reducing violence, Honduras still faces underlying institutional vulnerabilities that led to the rise of violence in the first place. So what are the unintended consequences associated with the increased role played by PMOP, and how will that impact human rights, right? So that's in general where I'm planning on taking this particular piece. I've laid out my comments really in sort of three parts. First, I'm going to talk about the context in Honduras, because I think the context is really important. And it's key to understanding sort of what's shaping perceptions in public demands in Honduras. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the government has done to respond to that, namely talking about the creation of PMOP and sort of the types of policies that the government has encouraged. And then finally, I'm going to throw out some challenges and policy options. Really, I'm going to throw out some things that I'm just sort of stream of consciousness, right, that I'm thinking about that I think we have to kind of consider going forward. So first, let me start by talking about what I think are three primary considerations driving the militarization of police in Honduras. First, intuitively, high violence, right? So Honduras today, it's going to be trumped by, I suspect it's going to be trumped by El Salvador when we close out this year, but Honduras is still considered the most violent, non-warring state in the world, right? Again, the most violent, non-warring state in the world. Venezuela hasn't made it there, but they're all three competing, unfortunately. Venezuela, El Salvador, and Honduras. But Honduras has sort of claimed that spot for the last 5 years. And in fact, at some point, or rather, within the last few years, we've reached violence levels or homicide levels as high as 90 per 100,000, more than 90 per 100,000, right? To kind of put that in context, in Mexico, which many Americans consider to be one of the most violent countries in the world, right, only registers a homicide rate of just in the low 20s, right? Because that kind of puts it in context, right? So Honduras is incredibly violent. Two, gangs, within sort of the context of high violence, gangs, transnational criminal organizations are operating with near impunity. They're destabilizing many communities throughout these countries, well, throughout Honduras and El Salvador, and many others more broadly in Latin America. According to America's Barometer and Latino Barometer, security is the most prevailing issue on the minds of most citizens in Honduras, right? So more than nearly 60% of Hondurans said that security was the most prevailing issue. In 2014, more than half of the population polled in Honduras favored harsher punishment for criminals, right? I mean, so they have been placing demands on the state to take a more assertive and harsher approach to combating crime. So that's one, high levels of violence. Two is public trust in the military is high, and it's low in all other institutions. According to Vanderbilt University's Latin American Public Opinion Project, the military is the most trusted institution in Honduras. Most trusted government institution in Honduras is the second most trusted institution, second to the Catholic Church, right? And in my assessment, this is not so much a result of anything the military has done, right, other than remain in the barracks. Rather, this is really an indictment of the failure of other institutions, right, police, executive, legislature, to provide public goods, to include security. And then finally, sort of within this context of high violence, we're talking about when you start to compare these institutions, data on trust in the military is extremely higher than when you look at the trust in the national police. So, for example, in the context of Honduras, on a scale from 0 to 100, the national police were scored about 47, while the police were scored nearly 65 in terms of trust. Third is resource capacity. So the militaries tend to be perceived, if not really, in Honduras, better trained, right? The concept of plata plomo, right, seems to be a silver bullet, perceived to be a silver bullet. They're better equipped. They don't have the same baggage associated with the national police. And this is also sort of propelling the military as being an alternative to taking on, the domestic security situation. So in that context, what is the government's response? In 2003, Honduran President Ricardo Maduro implemented what we call mano dura policies, right? This is sort of the heavy-handed approach. And today there's a lot of debate out there as to whether or not community policing versus the heavy-handed approach is the most effective. In any case, the Honduran president took this particular approach. And the idea was that they wanted to essentially take the zero tolerance. They started to throw, if you had tattoos, any resemblance of being affiliated with gangs, you simply didn't have to commit a crime, you were thrown in jail. Oftentimes, it wasn't uncommon to see, extreme human rights violations in which, gang members or delinquents were being shot on site, right, with very little reaction from the population. Interestingly, we had three major prisons burned down over the course of 2003 to 2012, killing hundreds of people. And what was really, I think, as a political scientist, what was really fascinating was the very limited reaction from the public in terms of the outcry for that, hundreds of people dying by an entire prison being burned down in very limited reaction. In fact, when you ask most people, it was oh well, what are we going to do? And that was sort of the response that we were finding in focus groups when we started to sort of explore, those reactions. And so in 2013, the president the current president started to evolve the mano dura policies, and essentially we found the establishment of the PMOP, right, as well as another quasi-militarized organization, which is largely the Tigres, which is a domestic intelligence apparatus that sort of is comprised of both the military and national police. And so now, while data is very difficult to find in terms of the reduction or the impact that PMOP has had since 2013, we have seen a decrease in overall homicides. In fact, this year, they're expecting to drop nearly 20 plus points per, in terms of year-to-year comparison on number of, the per rate homicide or the per person homicide rate in Honduras. But at the same time, between 2012 and 2014, Honduran soldiers were accused of 9 homicides, more than 20 cases of torture, and more than 30 illegal detentions, right? Now, prior to 2012, so when the military was in the barracks, there was 0. So that's a 100% increase, right? And a lot of people would make the argument that, well, the military institution is the most trusted, it's the most effective, it's the least corrupt. But we weren't necessarily taking into account that they weren't in the streets, right? And the corruption was occurring in the military, but it was at the high levels. And that's because the day-to-day interaction of the military institution was largely regulated to certainly senior leadership engagement and that kind of discourse. Not so much having soldiers in the streets, having to interact with the population. And so we're starting to see some residual, concerns with respect to having the military in the streets on a day-to-day basis, right? And so, this is sort of the genesis of where I wanted to take this paper and kind of evaluating, this outcry for the military institution and assessing the potential, unintended consequences that putting the military in the streets could have, particularly in the context of human rights. So I just want to posit a few challenges and what I think are policy options, and hopefully I'm rushing through it quick enough that we can have a conversation. But, first thing that we have to kind of consider is what are the trade-offs, right? And it's a very difficult discussion to have, particularly among organizations that have such a passionate discourse in human rights and the human rights mission. But what are the trade-offs? In other words, the question that comes to mind is how many human rights violations are acceptable in exchange for a reduction in homicides or violence, right? It's difficult to kind of approach this at zero sum. In other words, it's, we can have 0 while still decreasing, because that doesn't seem to be I haven't found any circumstances in which that's been the case. There has to be some level of acceptable trade-offs, right? And trying to determine what those acceptable trade-offs are is I think, important for us in determining the level of pervasiveness of the military or how long you keep the military out in the streets, right? And again, I'm talking about this in the context of using the military institution or the militarization of policing. The second is how do you fortify the military institution from the increased vulnerabilities to being corrupted and to propagate human rights violations. Again, I would argue that it's not that the military isn't corrupt. It's just the military hasn't been in the space to be co-opted, right? Maybe an anecdotal story. I was part of a program that was looking at corruption or anti-corruption programs I was working with a professor who was working on anti-corruption programs in the Dominican Republic. And there was a plan put forth to President Fernandez in the Dominican Republic that the most corrupt institution in the Dominican Republic was the traffic police, by far, right? I mean, the level of pervasiveness in the traffic police was just outrageous. And so there was a radical plan to President Fernandez to say, look, you know what? Let's just completely disband the traffic police, and let's, sort of reestablish a traffic police that has 0 corruption, that has the transparency and accountability measures necessary to keep this institution clean, right? And so they did this. They put the traffic police out in the street. And within a year, that new traffic unit was just as corrupt as the old one that they ousted, right? And so it kind of begged the question, well, how do you fortify these institutions, right? Because certainly the cop on the street, who's poorly paid, right, doesn't get a whole lot of respect for that particular position, is interacting, particularly on December 24th, right, Christmas bonus time, with someone who says, I really don't want a ticket, or I really don't want to go to jail, and I'm willing to kind of make an exchange here, right? And so we found that there were push and pull factors in the context of corruption. So how do you fortify these institutions, right? So you're taking an institution that you perceive to be clean with respect to the things that undermine, the capacity of the institution and that sort of propagate, corruption, human rights violations. How do you fortify that institution and sort of defend, that institution from falling down the same traps that you have with the other institutions, right? So that's one. That's the second one. And sort of following that same vein in sort of number 3 is how do you reform the institutions that were ineffective to begin with, right? I mean, this becomes another challenge. The military can't be seen as the long-term solution, right? So how do you employ the military while still maintaining the capacity to reform other institutions that should own that, that space? And so when you look at, for example, I was talking a little bit about the mano duro policies of the Honduran military, the Honduran government. During that time, there were plenty of efforts to reform the police, none of which worked, right? It's this concept of institutional trap. You're asking the corrupt officials to implement anti-corruption programs. I mean, it's just the logic is very difficult to kind of grasp. So how do you do that? How do you sort of re-attack these institutions so that you can weed out corruption and sort of put the types of mechanisms in place to protect them, right, in their position of serving the public good? So that's number 3. Number 4, how do you encourage civil society without undermining government's ability to disrupt crime and violence, right? You tend to see a very contentious relationship often, particularly in places like Honduras and other countries in Central America, which you have this contentious relationship between NGOs and the government, right? In fact, Lisa was talking about a fascinating case in Guatemala. We held some focus groups in Guatemala about 2 years ago, and we were in these highly urbanized spaces in the southern part, right, largely mestizo. These are places that were hit with high levels of violence. And we started to poll people about what they thought, because one of the concerns that we had pop up on sample surveying was that there was a flood of NGOs moving into the country, right? I mean, there was just this overwhelming number of NGOs operating in Guatemala. And it was interesting, and for me it was I don't know if it was so much a aha moment as it was a just sort of thought-provoking moment. So many respondents said, you know what, the concept derechos humanos is actually a bad concept. It is a tool being used by the criminals. In other words, the NGOs that were sort of promoting derechos humanos, kind of branding the idea of human rights, was actually creating space to allow the criminals to sort of provoke or propagate more crime and violence. And, it's kind of hard to accept that. It was hard for me to accept that. But just to kind of understand that relationship, I think, is critical, right? So for me, one of the challenges going forward is how do you build, the type of relationship, sort of symbiotic relationship between NGOs and civil society that with government that is not necessarily contentious, not serving the purpose of undermining or trying to sort of mitigate direct contact with NGOs from the state, or undermining, the capacity of police officers to want to go into small communities that might be inherently violent, right? How do you manage that relationship? Finally, the last is sort of how do you address the sort of longer-term generational issues, societal issues that's facing these countries? Sort of another anecdote. We're working, a colleague in the back there, Randy, and I co-authored a piece looking at drug policies in Honduras, and we wanted to understand what was really going on with respect to violence. So we were working with a group called the Observatorio de Violencia at the National Autonomy University. And they felt they had some groundbreaking research in terms of what was propagating the high levels of violence. So they put, this big circle in the middle, violence, right, high homicides, and they started to list all of the factors that they were able to correlate with violence. I'll tell you what wasn't there first, drug trafficking, okay? I'll tell you what was there. Broken families, broken homes, right? Poor sanitation services, inept justice systems, inadequately trained security forces. I'm almost done. Inadequately trained security forces, a tolerance of violence in these urban communities. You had poverty, unemployment, inequality, right? So none of these things that I really thought were provoking violence because, we were kind of told it was drug trafficking. We were told it was cartels provoking violence. But all of these other societies, how do you solve those, right? And those aren't things that you solve overnight. These are generational. And so now you're deploying a military institution in the streets to combat crime and violence. But yet you got all of these other major issues that you still have to move the needle forward as well. So ultimately for me it was about sustaining success is predicated on the state's ability to strengthen institutional capacities to mitigate and combat crime, improve rule of law, reduce corruption, and again, control human rights. So thank you.
With that, we are concluding our program. Thank you once again.
I wanted to speak on.
Yes, sorry. Does anyone have any questions that you'd like to?
I just want to touch on the militarization of policing. And Ferguson, we had a very serious problem with that. I mean, and it only escalated the problems and the situation terribly. And to the extent where we literally saw, it was like a war zone, where the First Amendment rights were totally being violated, to the extent where they put in place curfews, they put in place mass arrests. I mean, it was really, really, really bad. But then, during that time when they were peacefully protesting, that's when they were really aggressive. But when the violence kicked in during the looting, they were nowhere to be found. I mean, they literally let businesses burn down to the ground. And so I'm saying, when should they actually come out? That's the question. You know, when should they actually use military? When should the law enforcement actually militarize on the streets? Is it when people are peacefully protesting, or when they're violently, burning buildings down? And they were not there when that happened. Yeah. They burned the place down, and no one was to be found. Even the fire department, they had to leave their hose behind because there were no protection around at all.
That's a great example, and it's a good question. I don't know, and I think the context, particularly in El Salvador, is maybe a little different. I mean, the militarization is to some degree a demand from the majority, right? It's really the majority saying that they need to go in and sort of be more assertive, more heavy-handed, if you will. The problem is we haven't seen the kind of collateral damage yet that really causes the population to sort of go in the opposite direction, right, in terms of their demands on the government. And that's kind of where I'm waiting to see how, for example, the PMOP in Honduras, at what point does it solicit the kind of reaction that would put the military back in the barracks, right? Because this isn't about the police becoming more militarized. It's about the militarization of policing by putting the military in the streets, right? Because none of the other institutions can effectively control crime. So there's a context nuance there that I think is really interesting. And so I don't know the answer in the Ferguson case. I think that in general in the United States, I think that there's been a negative trend towards the militarization of policing. And I'm not sure that's certainly not at the demands of Americans. But in El Salvador, there is in Honduras, there are demands to bring the military into the streets more aggressively. I think that's what's a little concerning.
It's scary, too.
Yeah, and I think also, just to underscore that, if you look at countries where there is a history of, sort of foreign military activation. So I've just been teaching a class on disasters, and we're looking at the Haitian earthquake. So when you have a country that was occupied for almost 20 years by the United States military from 1915 to 1933 in Haiti, and then who arrives after, what is the first international force that arrives after the earthquake to bring supplies is, U.S. military helicopters. So I just think that, we have to look at these, and that's obviously a foreign military. Or in a country, like Guatemala, where there was an armed conflict where the military played a particular role, where the police played a role with the military. So I think it's hard to say, to make generalizations, and we have to look at this. And also, I think, who the citizens are. Like, I'd be really curious. So you did that study in the capital, and I think if you had done that, in indigenous rural communities, you would get a very different sense of people's relationship to the state apparatus, to the police, to the army, and whether they in fact would talk to somebody who was from another country because of. Still, there's the fear. I mean, in small towns where there were massacres, people lived with the people who committed the crimes because, you can't leave the small community. Yeah, that's your community. And that's where you have a house, and that's where you have a land, and that's where your loved ones are buried in the cemetery, and going to the cemetery is a big deal. People don't pick up and leave easily. And so you have to go to church with the person who was an informant, so that people still, even though the war ended 20 years ago, people are still, I think, afraid in some ways. So I think it's just very hard.
No, that's a great point. I think there is in the Guatemala case, you're right. There's a really contentious relationship between the military and the indigenous because of everyone knows heard the name Rio Smont, right? But the focus groups that we held were in the areas with the highest levels of crime and violence and delinquency, and in those areas, largely along the Pacific and the southern rim of Guatemala, is where we held our focus groups, largely mestizo populations, right? And these are the ones in these highly urbanized environments that were a little concerned about the role NGOs were playing in undermining state authority or the state's capacity to sort of effectively combat crime and violence. And the focus groups weren't us; they were, locals that were doing this.
Just chiming in really quickly. I think when we look internationally about the role of military generally uses interventionist forces as it relates to their role within the government. Hence, why you see such a high propensity of military generals ascending to the role of leadership in these international incidents. I think in the American situation, it really boils down to training and understanding and debunking the sort of romanticized myth of the military-industrial complex, right? What I mean by that is our military does not have the training, when you look at it, you look at basic training, does not have the training as a peacekeeping force. They are an interventionist force. So when they're called in, you basically have hundreds of folks called in with the mindset of shoot on sight or protect the status quo. You know what I'm saying? So when martial law is declared in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, you have situations where people are talking about getting sniped from roofs when they're just trying to survive. I saw it play out in '92 when Hurricane Andrew hit Florida, where it's basically you're telling homeowners, stay inside your home for fear of getting shot. And so we really have to change the paradigm of how we view the military-industrial complex, just in the sense of, from a funding standpoint, from a policy-driven standpoint. I mean, I always tell folks, but it's the truth. There are, the United States has 11 aircraft carriers, and the rest of the world has 8. Does anyone know that? You know what I'm saying? Like, we have 11. Everybody else in the world, 8. So I think we're over ready from an attack standpoint. I think we have to get out of the business of pushing it and saying we need this so-called strong military in order to tamper everyone else down. Mm-hmm.
So, Senator, I think you make a great point. Can I just, I'm sorry, I know the wine, it'll be there. And I think you're on to something that we also, at least, when I look at Central America, the way we view the role of our military, I mean, constitutionally, our military isn't really allowed to play sort of in the domestic sphere, right? But in other countries, the military is. And I think that's an important, even if nuanced, difference. The other thing that's really important, so I mean, you look at Mexico, for example, constitutionally, the military isn't allowed to go outside of Mexico, but yet you have a 200,000 person military institution that you have to put to some use because you're investing in it. So what are they doing? They're planting trees, they're doing these other things until they were called in to sort of address crime and violence. Keep in mind that the levels of crime and violence that we're seeing in Central America, for example, really sort of is a national security threat, right? Which is what the military is often sort of constituted to do. In fact, the president in El Salvador recently declared the gangs to be terrorists. He literally said, the gang truce, we had a gang truce that was brokered between the Salvadoran government and the MS-13 and 18th Street gangs in El Salvador, which are very strong and very institutionalized. This gang truce took place in 2012. It broke down this year. The breakdown of that truce is likely going to lead El Salvador to be the most violent country in the world this year when the books hit, in December. And so the state has actually turned towards that and said, you know what? The gangs, they're terrorists. We're going to treat them as terrorists. We're going to fight them with the military. And so the military has been called in the streets because the levels of crime and violence that these countries are facing have become national security threats. But therein lies the challenge, right? So now there's the call to bring the military in the streets, but how do you actually strengthen the government so that they can actually do their job, right? The institutional weaknesses are just, they're real, and that's ultimately what's propagating the need to bring the military in the streets either. And I wasn't trying to, and I'm not placing a value judgment whether I think the military is good or bad in the streets. I'm more concerned about sort of the legacy issues or the causal, issues that we're going to have by keeping the military in the streets, right? Because I do think that, as you point out, Senator, I think you're spot on, the military isn't trained to keep peace. They're not trained to peacefully take protesters down. I served in the military, and I was asked to do peacekeeping in Kosovo, and it kind of put us at conflict. Well, what are you supposed to do out there? You're supposed to watch people shoot each other, and that's really what our rules of engagement came down to. But the way those militaries are trained and function make it very difficult, and we're going to see how, PMOP, with its training to sort of serve in police roles, how this evolves, and at what point does, public demand to move them back into the barracks, right? I mean, the reason they went back to the barracks to begin with is because they dominated the government, right? I mean, we've had military governments all throughout South and Central America in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so they've only gone back to the barracks very recently. And it's being in the barracks and watching these countries, despite having some economic successes and some social successes, watching the levels of crime and violence just deteriorate rapidly, despite the other improvements. Now they're being called back out of the barracks and into the streets. And again, I don't have an answer as to how it's going to go, but I think it raises us, and we should pause and think about sort of the consequences of doing that.
I hate to cut off this discussion because it's been great, but we do have more food outside and a chance to engage with our speakers and with each other about what you've heard here today. I'd like to thank our speakers one more time for sharing your voice with us. And we do have a token of our gratitude here for each of our speakers. And Professor Wiesner, if you can come up here one more time.
Yeah, I wanted to just to express, thank you. Express again my gratitude to that panel of very different viewpoints. Wouldn't have known, but we see very different policy perspectives, different countries, different backgrounds, and I think that is just the variety we need at a university. We cannot be one way and all that. So let's be diverse, let's discuss, let's be strong in voicing our opinion and hold nothing back, but within the limits of civility and tolerance and respect. So I thank everybody again for coming to St. Thomas.